Hey everyone, welcome to Nightmare Scene. Before we begin, I'd love to know, which city are you listening from as you hear these spine-chilling stories? Leave a comment to let me know. Alright, now take a deep breath. Let's begin. It was the middle of winter when my uncle asked me to house sit. His place was tucked away in a remote area far from town, and the quiet isolation had a certain appeal. I'd always wanted to experience what it was like living on my own, so I jumped at the chance. The weather forecast predicted heavy snowfall, but I wasn't worried. The house was sturdy, and I looked forward to the coziness of being wrapped in a blanket by the fireplace, watching snowflakes drift down outside the window. My uncle left strict instructions: no friends over and no unnecessary trips outside. He said it was too easy to get caught off guard by the weather, and accidents could happen in a place like this. I shrugged it off, figuring he was just being overprotective. After he stocked the fridge and double-checked everything, he left and I settled in, excited for a quiet few days. The first night was blissfully peaceful. I went to bed early, listening to the muffled sound of the wind outside, and fell asleep almost instantly. But in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a noise. At first I thought it was just a dream, but then it came again, a faint rhythmic tapping. I froze, trying to convince myself it was the house settling or the trees swaying in the wind. But this was different. The sound was deliberate, almost like a soft knock. My pulse quickened, but I took a few breaths and managed to calm down, chalking it up to paranoia. I lay there in silence, willing myself to ignore it. Yet curiosity got the better of me. I crept over to the window and peeked outside. Snow had piled up over the porch, blanketing everything in a thick, soft layer. Under the pale light of the moon, I could see the entire yard clearly. And there, leading straight up to the front door, was a set of footprints. My heart thudded in my chest. The prints were small, like those a child might make, but there hadn't been any visitors. I strained my memory, trying to recall if I'd seen them earlier that day, but I was sure I hadn't. The snow had started falling in the afternoon and hadn't let up until late in the evening. These footprints were fresh, perfectly outlined in the snow. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they'd been there for longer, buried under the snowfall and then exposed by the wind. I almost convinced myself of this, but a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. Trying to calm myself, I double-checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked before heading back to bed. Still, sleep didn't come easily, and every small creak of the house felt amplified in the dark silence. The next morning, I almost laughed at myself. The footprints seemed less ominous in the daylight, and I was able to brush off the previous night as overactive nerves. After all, the mind could play tricks on you, especially in a strange place. I spent the day as usual, cooking, reading, and enjoying the solitude. But as the sun began to dip, my confidence started to waver. That eerie feeling crept back, settling over me like a cold shadow. I found myself glancing at the front door more often, the memory of those tiny prints playing on my mind. That night, I was lying in bed, letting the sound of the wind lull me to sleep, when I heard it again. The same faint tapping, only this time it was louder. I held my breath, listening intently. The tapping grew more persistent, almost rhythmic, like something, or someone, was pacing back and forth on the porch. I mustered up the courage to look out the window, and a chill ran through me. There were more footprints. The same small, almost childlike impressions, now trailing around the house in a loose, looping pattern, as if someone had been wandering in circles. My throat tightened and my mind raced. Who would be out there in the dead of night, walking around a stranger's house in freezing weather? I spent the rest of the night wide awake, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow in the room more menacing. I kept glancing at the window, dreading the idea of seeing another print, or worse, catching a glimpse of the person responsible for them. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but relieved. The footprints remained, marking the snow with an unsettling clarity that seemed almost deliberate. They stretched from one side of the house to the other, the pattern as erratic as it was disturbing. Whoever had made them had been outside for hours. I thought about calling someone, maybe even leaving the house until my uncle returned. But I reasoned that it was just some local kid playing a prank. The fear I'd felt seemed irrational in the daylight, and I tried to shrug it off once more, though my nerves were frayed. On the third night, the tapping came again. But this time it was followed by a soft scratching sound like fingernails running down the wooden door. The noise went on, steady and unrelenting, scraping away any shred of calm I had left. I forced myself to peek through the curtains, and that's when I saw it. A shadowy figure just on the edge of the porch, standing motionless. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, shrouded in darkness, facing the door. I stumbled backward, the image seared into my mind. I barely slept that night, every fiber of my being on edge, waiting for another sound, another sign that it, or they, hadn't left. The next morning, I packed my things and left, unable to stay a moment longer. I told my uncle what had happened, but he only looked at me with a raised eyebrow, unconvinced. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was nothing but my imagination in the dead of winter. But to this day, I still remember those footprints, leading right up to the door, circling the house like they had a purpose. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when I found it, a small box no larger than my hand sitting on my doorstep. There was no label, no return address, just a plain cardboard box left on the welcome mat. At first, I thought it was a simple mistake, a misdelivered package. I was used to getting packages dropped off on my porch like everyone these days, but this one was different. It had no markings, no shipping details, nothing that would tell me where it came from. I brought it inside, more out of curiosity than anything else, and set it on the kitchen counter. I hesitated before opening it, feeling an odd chill. When I finally peeled back the lid, there was nothing inside except an old, rusted key. The sight of it made my skin prickle, but I couldn't explain why. I didn't recognize the key, and it certainly didn't look like it belonged to anything I owned. I checked the box again, looking for a note or any sign of who might have sent it, but there was nothing. I left the key on the counter and tried to put it out of my mind. After all, I told myself, strange things like this happen all the time. People misplace things, packages end up at the wrong address. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the image of that key sitting there, silent and unremarkable yet somehow disturbing. There was something unsettling about its rusty, worn edges, as if it had a history I was unaware of but felt almost haunted by. Days passed, and I began to forget about the strange delivery. But then, just as I started to relax, another package showed up. This time it was a bit larger, about the size of a shoebox, but just as plain and unmarked. I didn't want to open it. In fact, every instinct told me to just leave it outside. But curiosity gnawed at me until I gave in and brought it into the house. Inside, neatly folded and oddly pristine, was a sweater I'd lost months ago. I'd searched everywhere for it, my car, my office, even my parents' house, but eventually gave up, assuming I'd misplaced it beyond recovery. And yet, here it was, returned to me with no explanation. A cold dread settled in my chest. How had this ended up here? Who would go to the trouble of finding a lost sweater only to return it anonymously in such a strange way? I felt exposed, as if someone had been watching me all along, knowing exactly what I'd lost, knowing exactly where to send it. I peered out the front window, searching the street for any sign of someone lingering nearby, but the neighborhood was empty and still. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak and whisper of the house seemed amplified, feeding my unease until it was all I could hear. A week passed without incident, and I managed to convince myself that it was a bizarre prank. Maybe a friend playing a joke, though none of them admitted to it. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion that something was wrong. Then, on a Friday night, I returned home to find yet another package waiting on my porch, much larger this time, with a weight that made my stomach drop the moment I picked it up. I carried it inside, heart pounding, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave it alone. But I couldn't resist. I set it down on the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and opened the lid. Inside was a framed photograph, but as I stared at it, my hands began to tremble. It was a picture of me sitting on my couch exactly as I had the night before. The angle was slightly skewed, as if taken from outside the living room window. My skin went cold. Someone had been watching me close enough to take this picture without me ever realizing. I dropped the box, backed away, and ran to the windows, frantically pulling the curtains closed. My mind raced with questions, each more horrifying than the last. Who was doing this, and why? The next morning, I decided to call the police. They came by, asked questions, and took a few notes, but without any solid evidence, they didn't have much to go on. There were no fingerprints, no clues as to where the packages had come from. They advised me to stay vigilant, to call if anything else happened, but there was little they could do. For the next few nights, I barely slept. Every sound, every shadow felt like an imminent threat. I checked the locks repeatedly, scanned every window for signs of someone lurking outside. But days passed, and there were no more packages, no more signs of intrusion. I started to think, maybe foolishly, that it was over. Whoever was doing this had moved on. Then one evening, as I was drifting off to sleep, a faint knock echoed through the house. It was soft, barely there, but unmistakable. I sat up, every muscle tense, and listened. Another knock followed, then silence. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stand, to move toward the door. I peered through the peephole, half expecting to see an empty porch, but instead, there was a package sitting there, stark against the darkened doorstep. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I backed away slowly, leaving the package where it was. The next morning, it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. But even now, I still feel the chill of that night, as if someone is out there watching, waiting, and I can't shake the feeling that it's far from over. It was past midnight when I first heard the sound. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling, a familiar creak or groan from the old wood. But the noise repeated, this time louder, unmistakably the sound of cautious, deliberate footsteps coming from downstairs. My heart began to pound as I lay in the dark, straining to listen. It couldn't be my imagination. Someone was in my house. I glanced at the clock, 3:12 a.m. I was alone except for my daughter Lily, who was sleeping in the next room. I couldn't let panic take over, not with her here. I carefully slid out of bed, stepping as quietly as possible down the hall toward Lily's room. She was still asleep, her small form curled up under the blanket, completely unaware of the danger lurking just a floor below. My mind raced through my options. I had to keep her safe. I guided her to the closet and gently nudged her inside, whispering that she needed to stay quiet, stay hidden. Closing the closet door behind her, I moved back toward the hallway, grabbing the old baseball bat from the hall closet as I went. It wasn't much, but it was something. As I reached the top of the stairs, the faint murmur of voices reached my ears, low and urgent. It wasn't just one person. There were two of them, speaking in hushed tones as they rifled through drawers and cabinets in the kitchen. My grip on the bat tightened, and I struggled to keep my breathing steady. My phone was in the kitchen, charging, which meant I couldn't call for help. But I knew I had to do something. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and I froze, heart thundering as their voices abruptly fell silent. I held my breath, praying they hadn't heard. After a tense moment, they resumed, their voices shifting to another room further from the stairs. I took a shaky breath, relieved but on edge, knowing I had to act quickly. From where I stood, I could make out the dim outline of two figures, both dressed in dark clothes, moving carefully through my things. I had no way to tell what they were looking for, but the thought of them finding Lily made the air thick with dread. I didn't have much of a plan beyond scaring them off. But just as I steeled myself to confront them, one of the intruders lifted his head and spotted me. For a brief second, we were both frozen, staring at each other. Then he began to move up the stairs, fast and sure, closing the distance between us. I gripped the bat and swung as hard as I could, connecting with his shoulder. He stumbled back, cursing, but didn't fall. Fear coursed through me, but I knew I couldn't stop. The struggle was chaotic and desperate, every inch of me consumed with the need to protect Lily. He lunged for the bat, ripping it from my hands, and I felt a surge of raw panic. I needed to keep him from getting past me, from discovering Lily. Summoning every ounce of strength, I broke free of his grip and sprinted down the hallway back to her room, where I slammed and locked the door. I backed up, pressing my ear against the wood, listening to the heavy, angry footsteps approaching the door. The handle rattled, and then they began pounding on the door, calling out threats. I tried to keep calm, forcing myself to think clearly. There was a window in the room, leading to a narrow ledge just big enough to hold me and Lily if we could climb out safely. I knew it was our only chance. I unlatched the window and climbed out onto the ledge, pulling Lily up beside me. We were on the second floor, and there was a tall oak tree close enough to jump to if we could gather the courage. With a deep breath, I helped her onto a thick branch, then followed, our hands gripping tightly as we climbed down as quietly as possible. I didn't look back, didn't dare, until we reached the ground and began running. We didn't stop until we reached the neighbor's house, pounding on their door in desperation. When they let us in, I managed to explain what had happened, my voice shaking as the events replayed in my mind. They called the police while I clung to Lily, trying to shield her from any more fear than she'd already endured. It felt like hours before the police arrived, though it was likely only minutes. When they entered the house, the intruders were gone, but they had left the rooms ransacked, drawers overturned, my belongings scattered and broken. They had taken what they could, but their intentions went beyond theft. That much was clear. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on my neighbor's couch, holding Lily close, listening to every sound with suspicion. In the morning, I returned home with the police to see the full extent of the damage. My home, my safe space, had been violated, invaded by strangers who cared nothing for the lives they disrupted. Every room was a reminder of the terror I'd felt, of the helplessness of those endless moments on the stairs, of the dread of them finding Lily. After the police finished taking statements and searching the house for any remaining evidence, I stood alone in the quiet aftermath. The emptiness of the rooms felt hollow, foreign, as if this place were no longer my own. My sense of safety had been shattered, leaving only the echo of fear in its place. I knew we couldn't stay there, not right away. So I packed a few things and we went to stay with friends, where I tried to reassure Lily and myself that we were finally safe. But even after days had passed, even as I tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows brought back the sounds of that night. I'd wake in the early hours, straining to hear the faintest hint of an intruder's steps, my mind replaying the haunting fear of those moments, knowing it would be a long time before I ever felt truly secure again. A few months ago, I rented an Airbnb in a small, remote town, hoping to escape the chaos of the city for a weekend. The listing had excellent reviews, describing a cozy two-story cottage that was perfect for a quiet getaway. The host seemed friendly in the messages, sending a detailed guide to the area and a reassuring note about the property's security system, mentioning that there were cameras installed at the front door and in the living room. Just for safety, he'd said. I didn't think much of it. After all, lots of rentals have security cameras now. I arrived on a Friday evening just as the sun was setting and felt instantly at ease. The cottage was quaint, with a rustic charm that matched the pictures. After a long week at work, the solitude and stillness of the place were exactly what I needed. I spent the first night cooking a simple dinner and curling up on the couch with a book, letting the peace of the surroundings settle in. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves outside and the soft hum of the refrigerator. The next morning, a gloomy fog blanketed the area, so I decided to stay in and relax, cooking breakfast and watching movies on my laptop. Everything felt quiet and a bit too still, but I enjoyed the calm. By afternoon, though, I started to feel a faint sense of unease. It was hard to explain, but it felt as though I was being watched. I glanced out the window and saw nothing but mist and trees swaying in the breeze. I tried to shrug it off as paranoia, just a natural side effect of being alone in a new place. By evening, the feeling had grown stronger. I was sitting on the couch, my back to the stairwell, when I heard what sounded like a soft thud from somewhere above me. The noise was faint, almost inaudible, but distinct enough to make my skin prickle. I froze, heart pounding, telling myself it was probably just the house settling, the wood contracting in the cold. But the uneasy feeling lingered, nagging at me. I decided to ignore it, convincing myself I was being ridiculous, and returned to my book. Then, after half an hour of silence, it happened again, a heavier, clearer sound like something falling on the floor upstairs. I put my book down, my hands slightly shaking as I looked toward the stairwell. I was certain the cottage was supposed to be only one story. I distinctly remembered checking the rooms when I arrived, each door closed and undisturbed. But this sound, it was coming from directly above me. A chill ran through me, but I tried to remain calm. It was possible the house had an attic I hadn't noticed, or maybe the sound was from an animal outside. Forcing myself to relax, I got up and began checking all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. I even opened the closet doors and peeked inside, feeling foolish but unable to shake the dread gnawing at me. Just as I was about to sit down again, I remembered the host's mention of the cameras. There was one in the living room and one at the front door. Perhaps I could check the footage to reassure myself that I was alone. I found the camera feed app on the cottage's tablet, which had been left on the counter, and hesitated a moment before opening it. The feed loaded, showing a live view of the front door. The screen was grainy and slightly distorted from the fog outside, but I could clearly see the empty porch, the misty outline of the steps leading up to it. I swiped to the living room feed, expecting to see myself on the couch. But the room was empty. I blinked, feeling a cold, sinking dread spread through me. The feed showed the living room from a wide-angle perspective. The couch, the windows, the door to the kitchen, they were all visible. But I wasn't in the frame. It was as if I'd disappeared. I set the tablet down, heart racing, trying to think of a rational explanation. Perhaps there was a delay in the feed. But as I stared at the screen, I felt something shift behind me, a faint sense of movement. I whipped around, my pulse hammering, only to find the room empty, quiet, just as it had been. But now the silence felt charged, heavy with something I couldn't define. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone in the house. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside felt amplified, like a constant reminder of an unseen presence. The camera footage replayed in my mind, the empty couch, the eerie stillness. Hours passed with me sitting upright on the edge of the bed, too afraid to close my eyes. The next morning, I packed my things, deciding to leave a day early. I messaged the host, telling him I wasn't feeling well and had to cut my stay short. He replied almost instantly, saying he was sorry to hear that and hoped I'd come back again. But there was something about the message that felt oddly formal, like it wasn't quite him who'd written it. As I walked out to my car, I glanced up at the cottage one last time. The windows stared back at me, dark and hollow, as if hiding a secret that I would never fully understand. Just as I unlocked my car, I heard a faint sound behind me, a soft tapping like fingers drumming lightly on glass. I turned, eyes drawn back to the cottage. But there was no one there, only the still, empty windows. I drove away, unable to shake the lingering sensation that something or someone had been watching me the entire time. And though I returned to the comfort of my own home, the feeling of that quiet, ominous presence followed me, settling into the corners of my mind, making every creak and shadow a reminder that I had been in a place where I was never truly alone. A few months ago, 3 friends and I decided to go hiking in a remote national park. The trail we chose was barely marked on the map, overgrown and untouched, winding deep into the forest. We were drawn to the isolation, craving an adventure that took us far from the familiar. We set off early in the morning, laughing and talking, the weight of our backpacks seeming light with the excitement. The first few hours of hiking were peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the dense trees, casting soft shadows across the path. Birds chirped high above, and every so often, a faint rustling in the underbrush reminded us of the quiet life around us. But as we pushed deeper, the atmosphere began to change. The forest became darker, thicker, and the sounds of nature slowly faded into silence. A strange, almost suffocating stillness settled around us. Around mid-afternoon, one of us noticed footprints on the trail ahead. They were fresh, deeply pressed into the dirt, as though someone had passed through only moments before. We stopped, each of us glancing at the tracks with a quiet unease. Despite the remoteness of the trail, it was still possible that another hiker had come through. Yet, something about the footprints felt unsettling. They weren't erratic or meandering. Instead, they followed a precise line down the path, almost as if the person had been walking with intense purpose. As we continued, the footprints remained always ahead of us, stretching down the trail and into the thickening shadows of the forest. Each time we expected to round a corner and see the person who made them, there was nothing. Just the silent woods and the steady line of tracks, disappearing around the next bend. By the time the sun began to dip below the treetops, the footprints had become an unspoken weight. None of us wanted to talk about them, yet we couldn't stop looking. As the shadows grew longer, the path led us to a small clearing, a quiet, empty patch surrounded by dense trees. We decided to set up camp there for the night, more out of necessity than comfort, and tried to shake off the lingering unease. That night, we huddled around the campfire, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts. The footprints came up in our conversations in hesitant murmurs, each of us trying to brush off our fear. Yet, the quiet settled over us like a thick blanket, pressing down, until even our attempts at humor felt hollow and out of place. The stillness grew deeper as night fell, and by the time the fire began to die down, the forest was silent. There was no wind, no chirping of insects or distant rustle of animals, just an unnatural quiet that wrapped around us, heavy and oppressive. One by one, my friends drifted to their tents, leaving me alone by the embers of the dying fire. I sat there for a while, staring into the faint glow, feeling as if something were waiting just beyond the circle of light. Hours passed, and I was beginning to drift to sleep when I heard it, a faint crunch like a footstep on dry leaves. I froze, straining to listen, my heart pounding as the sound came again, closer this time. It was the unmistakable rhythm of someone, or something, moving outside our camp. My breath caught as I scanned the edge of the clearing, trying to pierce through the darkness. But I saw nothing, only shadows that seemed to shift and sway with an unnatural silence. The footsteps continued, soft but deliberate, as if someone were circling us in the dark, just beyond the reach of the dying fire's light. Every instinct told me to wake my friends, but fear held me rooted in place, unable to move or speak. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. I sat there, gripping the edge of my seat, waiting, listening to the pounding of my own heartbeat. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the forest remained silent. I finally let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself it was just an animal passing by. When dawn finally arrived, I felt a wave of relief, as if the daylight had banished whatever fear had gripped me the night before. My friends woke up, and as we packed up camp, none of us mentioned the strange quiet of the night. It felt easier to leave it unspoken, as if talking about it would make it real. As we set out on the trail again, we soon came upon the footprints. Only this time they weren't in front of us. They were scattered around our campsite, looping around in erratic circles, as if someone had walked back and forth, just outside our tents, all night. A sick feeling settled in my stomach as I traced the path of the prints. They didn't seem like the cautious tracks of an animal or the playful circles of someone lost. Instead, they were disturbingly methodical, as though someone had been watching us, moving in slow, calculated loops, studying our small camp from every angle. The sense of being observed, of an unseen presence lurking in the shadows, overwhelmed me. We continued down the trail in silence, each of us glancing over our shoulders, our conversation now tense and guarded. The forest that had once felt peaceful now felt like a trap, a maze of trees hiding something we couldn't see but could feel with every step. By the time we reached the end of the trail hours later, none of us spoke about the footprints. We returned to our cars, each of us eager to escape the suffocating quiet of the woods, the shadows that felt too close. I haven't been back to that forest since, but I often think about those prints, how they circled us, how they appeared just as we thought we were alone. Sometimes, in the still of the night, I can almost hear the faint crunch of footsteps on leaves, a reminder of the presence we left behind, hidden somewhere deep within those endless trees. My fiancée and I were on a road trip, traveling through long stretches of quiet highways and desolate towns. It was getting late when we decided to stop for the night at a small rundown motel on the outskirts of a quiet town. The motel looked abandoned, with its faded sign and a parking lot covered in cracks and weeds. But we were both exhausted, too tired to keep driving, so we pulled in and checked into a room. The motel clerk seemed distant and strange, barely making eye contact as he handed us the key. His expression was blank, almost cold, and he seemed eager for us to leave the lobby. We brushed it off, thinking he was just tired or having a rough night. We made our way to the room, which was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew. The lights flickered when we turned them on, and the wallpaper was peeling in the corners. It wasn't comforting, but it would do for one night. After a quick dinner of gas station snacks, we climbed into bed, hoping to get a few hours of rest before hitting the road again in the morning. I was lying there, staring at the ceiling and trying to ignore the strange noises from the room next door, when I heard a faint scratching sound near the window. I brushed it off as the wind, but the sound persisted, soft and almost rhythmic, like someone dragging their fingers along the glass. A cold feeling settled over me, and I found myself turning to look at the window. Outside, hidden partially by the shadows, I could just make out the silhouette of a man standing by our car. He was barely visible, his features obscured by the darkness, but his figure was unmistakable. He was facing our room, motionless as if watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I nudged my fiancée awake, pointing toward the window. By the time he looked, the man was gone. We scanned the parking lot, but there was no one in sight, just the dim glow of a street lamp in the outline of our car. My fiancée shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a passerby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tried to push the thought from my mind, telling myself I was just being paranoid. We locked the door, closed the curtains, and eventually fell into a restless sleep. But later that night, I woke up again. This time, the scratching sound was louder, more deliberate, as though someone were standing right outside trying to get our attention. My heart pounded, and I lay there, frozen, listening as the sound continued, scraping against the window in a slow, unnerving rhythm. I forced myself to look through a crack in the curtains. There, standing in the exact same spot as before, was the man. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed directly on our window. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, a silent silhouette against the night. I felt my breath catch, my skin prickling with fear. This time, I didn't wake my fiancée. I just lay there, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for the man to leave, but he remained there, unmoving. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by the image of him standing there, staring. In the morning, I cautiously opened the curtains, half expecting to see him still there, but the parking lot was empty, and the morning light made everything feel a little less menacing. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the eerie motel behind. As we checked out, I mentioned the man to the clerk, describing his strange behavior and how he seemed to be watching our room all night. The clerk barely reacted. He shrugged and gave me an odd smile, muttering something about local visitors before returning to his paperwork. His lack of concern only added to the uneasy feeling in my gut. I wanted to ask more, but something in his cold expression warned me to leave it alone. We left the motel and continued on our way, relieved to be miles away from that place. But later, as we stopped for gas, I felt an inexplicable urge to look around. And there, parked a few spots away, was a car I recognized, the same old, faded model that had been outside the motel with a figure inside watching us through the window. My blood ran cold as I quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. For the next few hours, I kept my eyes on the road, but every so often, I would glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following us. Each time we stopped, I scanned the area, tense and alert, feeling the weight of an unseen gaze. We tried to laugh it off, telling ourselves it was all a strange coincidence, but the sense of dread lingered, thick and unshakable. That night, when we finally arrived at a new hotel, I kept the curtains closed, triple-checked the locks, and tried to shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. Even now, months later, I find myself checking windows whenever I stop for the night, looking out into the darkness, half expecting to see that shadowed figure, silently watching, waiting, never too far away. A few months ago, I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in the mountains, hoping to clear my mind and enjoy a break from the routine. I picked a trail that wasn't too popular, a narrow path winding through dense woods that few people seem to use. The solitude was peaceful at first, and I enjoyed the quiet, letting myself get lost in the rhythm of my footsteps and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The day went by smoothly, with nothing but the occasional distant bird call breaking the silence. By late afternoon, the trail led me through a particularly dense part of the forest, where the trees grew close together, casting deep shadows across the ground. I felt a strange sense of stillness in this part of the woods, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I first noticed him, a man standing a short distance off the trail, barely visible among the trees. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could make out the outline of his figure. He was standing completely still, watching me. A sense of unease washed over me as I continued walking, trying to pretend I hadn't noticed him. But the silence around me seemed to grow heavier, each step echoing louder in my ears. I kept my gaze forward, resisting the urge to look back, telling myself it was probably just another hiker. After a few minutes, I dared to glance over my shoulder, but the man was gone. I tried to brush off the encounter as a coincidence, just another lone traveler taking a break. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something strange about him, something that made my skin crawl. I quickened my pace, eager to put some distance between us and reach my planned campsite before nightfall. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I arrived at a small clearing where I decided to set up camp. The air was cooler here and the trees loomed close, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers overhead. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at me, setting up my tent and lighting a small fire to keep warm as darkness fell. But even as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I glanced around the clearing, my eyes scanning the edges where the light from the fire faded into shadows. The memory of the man in the woods kept resurfacing, and I found myself straining to listen for any sound beyond the crackling of the fire. As the night deepened, I decided to crawl into my tent, hoping sleep would calm my nerves. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that feels too heavy, almost unnatural. I lay there, staring up at the fabric of the tent, trying to ignore the way my heart pounded with every rustle of leaves outside. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up with a start, a faint sound pulling me from my sleep. I lay still, holding my breath, listening intently. There it was again, a soft shuffling noise like footsteps, slow and measured just outside the tent. My blood ran cold as the sound grew closer, stopping mere inches from where I lay. I forced myself to breathe quietly, praying that whatever it was would go away. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of someone, or something, standing motionless just outside. The urge to look was overwhelming, but fear rooted me in place, my mind racing with images of the man I had seen earlier. What if he was out there now, just standing in the shadows, watching me? Every muscle in my body was tense, waiting as the seconds dragged by. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound faded. The forest was silent again, but the dread remained, thick and suffocating. I lay there, too afraid to move, waiting for the first light of dawn to break. When morning finally came, I crawled out of my tent, blinking in the early light, half expecting to see something, footprints, some trace of the intruder from the night before. But the ground around my tent was undisturbed, as if nothing had been there. I packed up quickly, the unease still gnawing at me, and made my way back down the trail, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and that clearing. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man in the shadows, watching from a distance. But the trail was empty, silent except for the occasional bird call. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees casting long shadows across my path as if guiding me out. By the time I reached my car, a wave of relief washed over me. I tossed my backpack inside and slid into the driver's seat, feeling the tension start to melt away. But as I started the engine and glanced back at the trail, I saw him again, standing at the tree line, partially hidden in the shadows, his figure barely visible. He was still watching, and I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine as I sped away, leaving him in the silent forest behind. To this day, I can't explain who he was or why he was there, but that image haunts me, a reminder of the quiet, unsettling presence I'd left behind in those dark woods. Every now and then, I think I see him, a figure lurking just at the edge of my vision, as if he somehow followed me out, a shadow waiting patiently, lingering just out of sight. It was around midnight when I pulled into a rest stop off the highway. I was on a long drive, heading home after visiting family in a neighboring state. The drive was supposed to take 6 hours, but I'd left late, and exhaustion had started to set in. I figured a quick stop to stretch my legs and grab a snack would help wake me up for the last stretch of the journey. The rest stop was eerily quiet. The lights in the parking lot flickered intermittently, casting brief shadows across the empty benches and tables. I was the only car in sight, and the isolation settled over me like a thick blanket. I'd done countless road trips before, but something about this place felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting. I climbed out of my car and stretched, breathing in the cold night air. As I made my way toward the vending machines, I noticed him, a man standing by the edge of the lot, just beyond the circle of light from the nearest lamp. He was motionless, facing my direction, his figure barely visible in the shadows. I tried to ignore him, brushing it off as just another traveler. But as I approached the vending machine, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a feeling of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see him looking elsewhere, maybe just taking a break like I was. Instead, his gaze was fixed on me, his face obscured by the darkness. A chill ran down my spine. I dropped a few coins into the machine, keeping my eyes on the snacks, pretending not to notice him. The selection process felt painfully slow, my fingers shaking as I pressed the buttons. Every instinct told me to get back to my car and drive away, but I didn't want to look panicked. After all, he hadn't done anything. But when I turned back toward my car, he'd moved closer. He was standing a few feet from the vending machine now, still in the shadows, his face hidden but his posture eerily calm, too controlled. My heart started to pound, and I forced myself to walk slowly, deliberately, back toward my car, feeling his presence behind me like a weight. Just as I reached the driver's door, I heard footsteps, a slow, deliberate crunch on the gravel behind me. I stopped, my hand hovering over the door handle, my heart racing. He was walking toward me, each step deliberate, unhurried, as if he knew there was no need to rush. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and I fought the urge to turn around. Instead, I opened the door quickly, slipping inside and locking it in one swift motion. My breath came in shallow gasps as I gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. I dared a glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him right behind the car, but he was still standing where I'd left him, only a few feet away. He wasn't moving anymore, just watching me through the windshield, his figure barely illuminated by the faint glow of the street lamp. I started the engine, my eyes flicking between him and the road. He didn't move, didn't react. But something about his stillness was terrifying, as though he was simply waiting, content to watch. I put the car in gear and slowly began to drive out of the lot, my gaze flicking back to him every few seconds. Each time he was still there, watching as my car inched away. Just as I was about to merge back onto the highway, I glanced into the rearview mirror one last time, and he was gone. The empty lot stretched out behind me, desolate under the flickering lights, and I told myself he must have left. But the fear clung to me, thick and heavy, as I drove. A few miles down the road, I finally started to calm down, convincing myself it was just a strange encounter, maybe an odd coincidence. But as I passed under a street lamp, something caught my eye. A car pulling onto the road a short distance behind me, headlights dimmed. I swallowed, my hands tightening on the wheel as I watched the car in my mirrors. It followed at a steady pace, matching my speed, never passing or falling behind. My pulse quickened as I realized it was the same model of car that had been parked at the rest stop. I tried to tell myself it was just another traveler, but each time I switched lanes, the car followed suit, mirroring my movements with unsettling precision. Minutes stretched into miles, and still the car remained behind me, always keeping the same distance, always following. I forced myself to focus on the road, trying to ignore the gnawing fear that had settled in my chest. But every time I glanced at the mirror, my stomach dropped. The car was still there, relentless like a shadow. I took an exit, hoping to lose him on the winding back roads, but he followed, his headlights dim, blending into the darkness behind me. I made sharp turns, looping through quiet residential streets, but he kept pace, never faltering, never letting me out of his sight. Finally, I pulled into a well-lit gas station, my heart pounding as I parked near the entrance. The car passed by slowly, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of him through the windshield. He was staring straight ahead, his expression blank, almost lifeless, as though he didn't see me at all. But deep down, I knew he had been following me, knew he'd been waiting for this exact moment. I waited in the gas station for over an hour, pacing the aisles, my mind racing with fear and confusion. When I finally returned to my car, he was gone, the lot empty except for a few scattered cars. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, my eyes scanning the road, the shadows, every car that passed, haunted by the feeling that he was still out there, lurking just out of sight. Even now, months later, I feel his presence every time I stop at a rest stop or glance at a car parked alone in the dark. It's as if he left a part of himself behind, an invisible mark that I can never fully shake, a reminder that some shadows never fade. It was a quiet evening, and I was home alone, enjoying a rare night of solitude. The rain had been coming down steadily since dusk, tapping softly against the windows. I settled in with a book and a warm drink, letting the gentle rhythm of the rain lull me into a sense of calm. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the sound of the wind outside. It felt peaceful, almost comforting, until I heard the knock. It was faint at first, a soft, tentative tap at the door. I froze, listening, wondering if I'd imagined it. It came again, a little louder this time, each knock slow and deliberate, as if the person on the other side was waiting, anticipating a response. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. No one should be at my door this late. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to rationalize the sound. Maybe it was just a neighbor needing something, or perhaps someone seeking shelter from the rain. But as I got closer to the door, a strange unease crept over me, prickling the back of my neck. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see a familiar face, but there was nothing there, just the empty porch, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlight. I stood there for a moment, waiting, feeling my heartbeat quicken as the seconds stretched out in silence. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a branch hitting the house or a trick of the wind, and turned back toward the living room. Then came another knock, louder this time, almost demanding. My stomach tightened and I turned back toward the door. I peered through the peephole again, but the porch was still empty. The rain continued to fall in steady sheets, and the streetlight flickered faintly, casting shifting shadows across the yard. I felt an inexplicable sense of dread, a deep, gnawing fear that told me I shouldn't open the door. But the knock came again, more insistent, as if whoever was out there knew I was hesitating, knew I was standing just on the other side. I backed away, my mind racing. Every instinct told me to ignore it, to lock myself in my room and wait for morning. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself reaching for the door, my hand trembling as I unlatched it. I opened it just a crack, enough to see outside, but there was no one there, only the darkened porch and the sound of rain echoing through the silence. I was about to close the door when something caught my eye. There, on the wet welcome mat, was a small package. It was plain and unmarked, with no label, no return address. I hesitated, feeling a chill run through me, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I picked up the package, feeling its strange weight, and closed the door behind me, locking it with an extra sense of urgency. I set the package on the kitchen table, staring at it for a long time, debating whether or not to open it. It looked ordinary enough, but there was something ominous about the way it had appeared, left in the dead of night, accompanied by those strange, empty knocks. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid, half expecting something sinister. Inside, carefully wrapped in a layer of cloth, was a framed photograph. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled it out, staring at the image. It was a picture of me taken from outside my house, through the very window where I'd been sitting earlier. The angle was unmistakable. Whoever had taken it had been standing right outside, watching me. A cold wave of fear washed over me as I stared at the photo. My mind raced, trying to remember if I'd seen anyone outside, any hint of movement in the dark. But I'd been alone all evening, wrapped in my own quiet thoughts, blissfully unaware of the presence lurking just beyond the window. I dropped the frame, backing away from the table as the realization hit me. Someone had been outside, watching me, close enough to take a picture without me even noticing. The rain continued to fall outside, but now it felt oppressive, closing in on the house, isolating me in a way I hadn't felt before. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window sending a fresh wave of fear through me. I checked the locks repeatedly, peering out each window, expecting to see a shadow lingering just out of reach. But the night wore on in silence, the empty streets stretching out under the pale light of the street lamp, as if mocking my fear. When morning finally came, I went outside, hoping to find some evidence, footprints, a sign of who had left the package. But the rain had washed everything away, leaving no trace, as though the entire encounter had been nothing more than a nightmare. But I knew it had been real. The photograph was proof, a reminder of the unseen presence that had watched me, waited, and left its silent message behind. In the weeks that followed, I found myself on edge, jumping at every sound, every shadow. The feeling of being watched lingered, a quiet paranoia that crept into my mind whenever I was alone. I never saw anyone outside my house again, never heard another knock. But every now and then, I catch myself glancing at that spot by the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching, waiting, their shadow blending into the night. I worked the night shift at a small 24-hour convenience store on the edge of town. It was the kind of job that was usually quiet, even a bit dull, especially in the early morning hours when most of the town was asleep. The only sounds were the soft hum of the refrigerators and the occasional crackle of the old radio. I was alone that night as usual, and halfway through my shift when things took a strange turn. It started around 2 a.m. I was restocking the shelves, lost in my own thoughts, when I heard the bell above the entrance door chime. Startled, I turned around expecting to see a customer, but the store was empty. I walked over to the door, peering outside into the dimly lit parking lot, but no one was there. The quiet lot was empty, with only my car parked under the street lamp. I shrugged it off, assuming the door had been triggered by a draft or a sensor malfunction. But then, just a few minutes later, it happened again. The bell chimed, louder this time, echoing through the empty aisles. I froze, a chill running down my spine as I glanced around the store. There was still no one there. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, convincing myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. I returned to stocking the shelves, keeping an ear out for any more strange sounds. About 10 minutes passed and I started to relax, thinking maybe it had just been a glitch with the door. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something, a faint movement at the far end of the aisle. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just rows of brightly lit shelves, empty and undisturbed. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. I tried to return to my routine, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Every small noise, every shadow seemed amplified, filling the store with an oppressive sense of tension. Then around 3 a.m. I heard a soft, muffled tapping sound. It was faint at first, almost rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers against the counter. The sound grew louder, echoing through the empty store, until I realized it was coming from the back storage room. I hadn't been back there since my shift started. I knew I was alone. A feeling of dread settled over me as I slowly made my way toward the back, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The door to the storage room was slightly ajar, and as I reached it, the tapping sound abruptly stopped. I held my breath, listening, waiting for any hint of movement. But there was only silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on me. I hesitated before pushing the door open, peering inside. The room was dark, filled with stacks of boxes and supplies. I switched on the light, casting a dim glow over the cluttered space, but there was no one there. The room was empty, perfectly still, as though no one had been there in hours. I turned off the light and closed the door, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. But as I stepped back into the main part of the store, I felt it, a presence, something watching me from just out of sight. I glanced around, my gaze sweeping over the aisles, but saw nothing. The hours crawled by, each minute stretching out as I waited for the end of my shift. Every sound, every flicker of movement in the corner of my vision felt amplified, like the store itself was holding its breath. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Then just before dawn, the bell chimed one last time. I froze, feeling a wave of dread wash over me as I turned to look at the entrance. For a brief, horrifying moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just outside the door, silhouetted against the pale light of the street lamp. But when I blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the empty parking lot and the faint glow of morning on the horizon. As my shift ended, I hurriedly locked up the store, eager to leave, but the memory of that shadowed figure lingered with me, haunting my thoughts. Even now, I can still hear the sound of the bell, the soft tapping in the storage room, the feeling of something unseen lurking just out of sight. I quit the job not long after that, unable to shake the feeling that I'd come too close to something I couldn't understand, something that was still waiting in that silent, empty store. And sometimes late at night, I think I hear the faint echo of a bell as if calling me back, reminding me of what I'd left behind. It was a freezing winter night, and I was driving down a long stretch of empty highway, the kind that stretches endlessly, with barely a turn in sight. I was the only car on the road, surrounded by darkness, the only light coming from my headlights slicing through the thick night air. The sense of isolation was comforting at first, a quiet drive with nothing but the hum of the engine to keep me company. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure standing just off the shoulder of the road, barely illuminated by my headlights. I couldn't make out any details, but it looked like a person, a silhouette standing motionless, watching the road. My initial reaction was to slow down, maybe even pull over to see if they needed help. But something about the figure felt wrong. I kept driving, my heart racing as I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure fading into the darkness. But instead, it was still there, perfectly still, watching as my car sped away. A chill ran through me, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter, telling myself it was just someone waiting by the roadside, though deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few miles down the road, just as I was starting to relax, I saw it again. This time, the figure was standing on the other side of the road, closer to the guardrail, its dark form blending into the shadows. I felt my pulse quicken, a sense of unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. There was no way that person could have moved that far, that quickly. I was sure I had left them miles behind. And yet, there they were, still watching, still perfectly still. I pressed harder on the accelerator, the headlights sweeping over the road as I sped up, my eyes glued to the pavement ahead. I kept telling myself that it was all in my head, that the figure was just a trick of the shadows, a product of my own tired mind. But the image of that motionless silhouette stayed with me, etched into my memory. As I continued down the highway, the figure began to appear more frequently, always just at the edge of my headlights, standing by the side of the road, watching. Each time I saw it, my skin prickled with fear and my heart raced faster. The figure never moved, never shifted, just stood there, waiting as if it knew I would see it. After nearly an hour of this, I finally pulled over at a rest area, hoping to collect myself and shake off the growing dread. I sat in my car, breathing heavily, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to calm down. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights, and for a moment I felt safe. I told myself that it was all just a trick of the light, my imagination playing tricks on me in the darkness. But as I looked up, scanning the edges of the lot, I saw it again. The figure standing at the far end of the lot, just beyond the reach of the lights. My stomach twisted as I watched, feeling trapped, as though no matter where I went, it would be there, waiting, watching. I couldn't stay there any longer. I threw the car into drive and sped back onto the highway, my heart pounding as I focused on the road, determined not to look into the shadows. But every mile, I couldn't resist glancing into the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure standing there, keeping pace with me. It wasn't long before I saw it again, this time in the distance, barely illuminated by my headlights. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, right in my path, as if daring me to get closer. My foot hovered over the brake, my mind screaming at me to stop, but something kept me from slowing down. I wanted to get past it, to leave it behind for good. As I approached, my headlights finally swept over the figure, casting it in a harsh, blinding light. For a brief second, I saw it clearly, a dark, shadowed form, face hidden, its posture unnaturally rigid. My heart froze as I passed, and in the split second before I left it behind, I felt its gaze turn toward me, a weight pressing down on me, heavy and unyielding. I drove for miles without looking back, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The highway stretched on, empty and silent, but the feeling of that gaze lingered, an invisible presence that I couldn't escape. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, the bright lights of the gas stations and buildings a relief against the darkness that had followed me. Even now, I can't shake the image of that figure from my mind. I avoid that stretch of highway whenever I can, but sometimes late at night I feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. And I know that if I ever look too long into the shadows, I might just see it there, waiting for me, watching with that same unnerving stillness. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. There was something calming about being out in the wilderness, away from the noise and bustle of everyday life. So, when I took a solo trip to explore a trail in a remote part of the state, I was excited. The trail wound deep into the forest, dense with towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, casting the woods in a soft, green twilight. It was peaceful, exactly what I had been hoping for. Several hours into the hike, I came upon a path that branched off from the main trail. It was narrow, overgrown, barely visible among the thick underbrush. Normally, I would have ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow it, eager to see where it led. After about 10 minutes of walking, the trees opened up into a small clearing, and there, standing alone in the center, was an old, abandoned cabin. The cabin looked like it had been left to rot for decades. Its walls were weathered and gray, the wood splintered and broken in places. The windows were shattered, and the door hung slightly open, swaying gently in the breeze. It was an eerie sight, but I felt an odd pull to explore it, a quiet urge to step inside. As I approached, a feeling of unease settled over me, prickling the back of my neck. I paused, questioning whether I should go in. But the silence of the forest was absolute, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves, and I convinced myself it was just an old, forgotten building, nothing to be afraid of. I pushed open the door, which creaked loudly, and stepped inside. The air was stale and musty, thick with the scent of decay. The cabin was small, just a single room with a dusty, broken-down table in the center and a few scattered pieces of old furniture. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling away to reveal the wood beneath, marked with strange, faint scratches that seemed to form vague patterns. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet felt amplified in the stillness, each sound echoing off the cracked walls. I walked slowly around the room, examining the scratches on the walls more closely. They were chaotic, but there was something almost intentional about them, like someone had clawed at the wood in a fit of rage or desperation. As I moved further into the cabin, I noticed something on the floor, a dark stain, faint but unmistakable, leading from the center of the room to the far corner. I didn't want to get too close, but my curiosity overpowered my hesitation. I crouched down, examining the stain, which looked like it had been there for years, blending into the wood as though it had always been a part of the floor. A sudden chill swept through the room, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I straightened up, trying to ignore the feeling of dread creeping over me. I told myself it was just an old cabin, nothing more. But then, just as I turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small, dusty mirror on the wall opposite the door. It was cracked and covered in grime, but as I approached, I could just make out my own reflection, distorted and dim in the murky glass. Something was wrong. My reflection seemed off, almost as if it were staring back at me with a slight delay. The more I looked, the more I felt as though it wasn't my own face at all, but a stranger's, mimicking my movements in a way that felt unsettlingly intentional. My skin prickled with fear, and I took a step back, feeling an urge to leave immediately. Just as I turned to the door, I heard a faint sound, a whisper barely audible coming from the direction of the mirror. I froze, straining to listen, but the whisper faded, leaving only the heavy silence. My heart pounded as I backed away from the mirror, keeping my gaze fixed on the door, my every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. As I reached the doorway, I glanced back one last time. The mirror had shifted slightly, and in its reflection I thought I saw movement, a shadow, something shifting just out of sight. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and hurried out of the cabin, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief as soon as I stepped back into the open air. The clearing felt different now, colder, the once peaceful silence now thick with an oppressive weight. I wasted no time getting back to the main trail, my mind racing, unable to shake the image of the mirror, the feeling that something had been watching me just beyond the glass. By the time I reached my car, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the forest. As I drove away, I glanced back at the trailhead, half expecting to see the cabin standing there, dark and silent among the trees. But the forest was quiet, empty, as if the cabin had never been there at all. For weeks after, I felt an odd compulsion to return to go back and see if it was real. But every time I thought about the mirror, the scratches on the walls, the shadow I had glimpsed in the reflection, a cold dread washed over me. I knew that whatever was in that cabin, whatever I had seen in that murky glass, was something I was never meant to find. It was late, and I was driving home on a nearly deserted highway after a long shift at work. The darkness stretched endlessly before me, interrupted only by the occasional flicker of headlights from a distant car or the soft glow of the passing streetlights. The hum of the engine and the smooth, empty road were almost hypnotic, lulling me into a sense of calm. I kept my eyes on the road, hoping to make it home quickly and finally get some rest. After driving for about half an hour, I noticed a car behind me in the rearview mirror. It had appeared out of nowhere, its headlights glaring brightly in the darkness, staying close to my bumper. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another late-night driver. I expected it to pass me, but it didn't. Instead, it kept its distance, following my every turn and lane change, never speeding up or falling back. A sense of unease began to settle in. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But as the miles passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and the headlights remained unwavering, following me with an eerie precision. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I kept driving, fighting the urge to pull over. Hoping to shake them, I took an unexpected exit onto a narrow, winding road that led through a small residential area. I drove slowly, watching the mirror, expecting to see the car turn off. But it didn't. It followed me down each twist and turn, keeping a careful distance but never losing sight of me. At this point, my heart was racing. I felt trapped, pursued, and completely alone on the dark road. I couldn't think of any reason why someone would be following me, but I knew I had to lose them. I sped up, weaving through the neighborhood, taking random turns, doing everything I could think of to throw them off. After what felt like an eternity, I finally turned onto a dead-end street, hoping it would force the driver to give up and leave. I slowed down, watching the headlights in the mirror, waiting for them to stop. But as I came to a halt, the headlights dimmed, and the car pulled over a short distance behind me. A cold dread settled in my chest. The car just sat there, idling in the dark, its headlights dim but unmistakably pointed directly at me. I couldn't see the driver, couldn't make out any details in the darkness, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and unrelenting, watching my every move. I tried to stay calm, forcing myself to think clearly. My first instinct was to call someone, but my phone was nearly dead, and I doubted it would last through a full conversation. I considered getting out and confronting the driver, but the thought of leaving the safety of my car terrified me. Then, slowly, the driver's side door of the car behind me opened. A figure stepped out, backlit by the car's headlights, their features obscured by the shadows. They stood still, facing my car, their posture unnervingly calm and composed. I couldn't see their face, but I felt their eyes on me, sharp and intent. A chill ran down my spine as I locked the doors, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. I didn't dare move, didn't want to make any sudden actions that might provoke them. The figure remained still, just watching, unmoving, as if waiting for something. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the car engines. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally turned and got back into their car. But they didn't leave. Instead, the car backed up slightly and parked, turning off its headlights but keeping the engine running. The darkened vehicle sat there, its silhouette barely visible in the shadows, but I knew they were still there, watching. I felt trapped, caught in an unnerving standoff with someone whose intentions I couldn't fathom. Minutes dragged by, each second amplifying my fear until it was all I could feel. I thought about trying to make a run for it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what they wanted, an opportunity to follow me into a more isolated area. In a desperate attempt to get help, I flicked my headlights off and on, hoping to attract someone's attention, though I knew it was unlikely anyone would be around at this hour. The car didn't react. The figure remained in the shadows as if patiently waiting for me to make a move. Finally, in a burst of panic, I slammed the car into reverse, backing up as quickly as I could, and sped away down the street. I didn't care about the twists and turns, I just needed to get as far from that car as possible. I took turns at random, my mind racing, feeling the eyes of the unseen figure pressing down on me, even as the headlights faded into the distance. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit gas station miles away, where I parked, trembling and out of breath. I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the car behind me again, but the road was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of that gaze, the calm, unblinking presence that had followed me through the night. After waiting a while and gathering enough courage, I finished the drive home, constantly checking my mirrors, my heart jumping at every set of headlights. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but the fear lingered, a gnawing dread that something wasn't over. Even now, every time I drive at night, I can't help but check my mirrors, searching for that familiar silhouette, half expecting to see those headlights trailing behind me, a reminder of that figure who still feels too close, hiding in the dark, waiting somewhere just out of sight. It was well past midnight, and the office building was deserted. I'd stayed late trying to catch up on work, and by the time I finally left, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. The elevator ride down to the basement parking garage felt longer than usual, each floor passing in eerie silence. When the doors slid open, I stepped into the dimly lit garage, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly against the concrete walls and empty parking spaces. My footsteps echoed loudly, reminding me just how alone I was. As I walked toward my car, parked near the far corner, I couldn't shake a creeping feeling of unease. The air was thick, heavy with a quiet that felt unnatural. Every few steps, I found myself glancing around, half expecting to see someone else in the shadows, though I knew I was supposed to be alone. Halfway to my car, I noticed a figure at the far end of the garage. They were standing completely still, partially hidden in the shadows near the exit. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was hard to tell in the dim light, but the person seemed to be facing me, watching. I told myself it was probably another late worker, maybe just a security guard on patrol. But something about their stance felt wrong, too stiff, too unnatural. They didn't move, didn't turn away or give any indication that they'd noticed me. They simply stood there, fixed in place like a statue in the shadows. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the prickling sensation that kept me glancing over my shoulder. The figure remained where they were, unmoving, though I couldn't shake the feeling that their eyes were following me, tracking my every step. I reached my car and fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking slightly as I unlocked the door. Just as I was about to climb in, I risked one last look toward the end of the garage. The figure was gone. The empty space where they'd been standing felt darker, the shadows deeper, as though they'd swallowed them whole. I slipped into my car, locking the doors immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. Taking a few steadying breaths, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just another tired worker like me, someone who had taken the stairs or exited another way. I started the engine, feeling a rush of relief as the familiar hum filled the silence. As I backed out of my space, my headlights swept over the concrete walls, briefly illuminating each empty corner. But as I turned toward the exit ramp, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror. The figure was back, standing right where my car had just been parked. They were closer now, their face still obscured in shadow, but I could tell they were facing me directly. A spike of panic shot through me, and I accelerated up the ramp, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the mirror, watching as the figure slowly receded into darkness. I reached the street level, breathing a sigh of relief as the garage entrance disappeared behind me, swallowed by the night. But the fear didn't leave me. Every red light, every stop sign felt like an eternity, my mind replaying the image of that figure standing so close to my car, watching in silence. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see them following me, to catch a glimpse of that shadowy form trailing just out of reach. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house felt like a sanctuary. I sat in the car for a moment, gathering my nerves before stepping out. The street was quiet, no sign of movement, no lingering shadows. I forced myself to breathe, to tell myself that it was all over, that whatever I'd seen in the parking garage was nothing more than a trick of the shadows, the result of a long, tiring night. But as I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left that figure behind. The quiet of the house felt too thick, too heavy, pressing down around me as I locked the door and checked the windows. That night, as I lay in bed, sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside set my nerves on edge, and I found myself listening, straining to hear any hint of movement. Just as I was beginning to drift off, I thought I heard a faint tap at the window, soft but deliberate. I lay frozen, my heart pounding as I waited, barely breathing, the seconds stretching out in silence. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch tapping against the glass. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, waiting, watching, hidden just beyond the edge of the light. The next morning, I checked every door, every window, looking for any sign of an intruder. But everything was normal, untouched. I wanted to forget about it, to move on, but the memory of that silent figure in the parking garage stayed with me, a shadow lurking in the back of my mind. To this day, I avoid the garage whenever I work late, parking instead under the streetlights, where the shadows can't hide. But sometimes, even in the well-lit spaces, I catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a dark figure lingering just out of sight, as if waiting for me to look, to notice, to remember that I was never truly alone that night in the parking garage. It was nearly midnight when I boarded the last train heading back into the city. The station was empty, its usually bustling platforms eerily quiet. The train itself was nearly deserted, and as I walked down the narrow aisle looking for a seat, I saw only a handful of passengers scattered throughout the car, each absorbed in their own world. I found a seat near the middle and settled in, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion after a long day. The train's lights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows over the rows of seats. I stared out the window, watching as the platform slid by, my reflection merging with the darkened landscape outside. A few stops later, a new passenger boarded. I didn't pay much attention at first, too tired to care, until I noticed them sitting a few rows ahead of me, perfectly still. They were seated on the edge of their seat, facing forward, hands resting in their lap, with an unnatural stiffness. I could only make out the back of their head, but something about their posture felt off, almost too rigid, as though they were waiting for something. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just another tired commuter like me, someone trying to get home. But the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. There was something unsettling about the way they sat, too still, too quiet. The rest of the passengers seemed oblivious, lost in their own thoughts, unaware of the strange tension that was building in the car. The train rattled on, stopping at each station for only a few seconds. Each time the doors opened, but no one new boarded. The other passengers began to get off one by one, and soon, it was just me and the silent figure a few rows ahead. The car grew colder, and a creeping sense of isolation settled over me. I tried to focus on my phone, anything to distract myself from the eerie stillness of my lone companion. But as the train entered a dark tunnel, the lights flickered and went out for a moment, plunging us into pitch blackness. When the lights came back on, my heart skipped a beat. The figure had turned slightly, their head angled just enough that I could now see the outline of their face. They were looking directly at me. A cold wave of dread washed over me, and I quickly looked away, pretending I hadn't noticed. But I could feel their gaze lingering, a heavy, unsettling pressure that made the air feel thick and stifling. I glanced at my reflection in the window, half expecting to see them behind me, closer than they should have been. But they remained in their seat, motionless, watching me in silence. The train continued through the tunnel, and the minutes dragged by, each second stretching out painfully as I fought to stay calm. I could feel their eyes on me, unblinking, as though they were studying my every move. My skin prickled, and I felt an urge to move, to change seats or even get off at the next station. But something held me in place, a strange, paralyzing fear that kept me rooted to my seat. Finally, the train emerged from the tunnel and pulled into the next station. I stood up, desperate to leave, even though it wasn't my stop. I moved quickly, my eyes fixed on the exit as the doors slid open. Just as I stepped off the train, I glanced back over my shoulder. The figure was still seated, but their head had turned fully now, following me with an unwavering gaze. I stepped onto the platform, my pulse racing, watching as the train doors closed. Through the window, the figure's face was partially obscured by shadows, but I could still see their eyes, dark and empty, locked onto me as the train pulled away. They didn't move, didn't blink, just watched, their face fading slowly into the distance as the train disappeared down the tracks. I stood there on the empty platform, my mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. The station was silent, and the realization that I was alone settled over me like a cold shroud. I waited for the next train, glancing nervously down the tracks, half expecting to see the figure's face staring back at me from the darkness. When I finally reached my stop and made it home, I felt a wave of relief, but the memory of that silent passenger lingered, haunting my thoughts. For weeks afterward, I avoided taking the late train, unwilling to risk another encounter. But even now, whenever I find myself alone on a quiet platform or sitting in an empty train car, I can't help but remember that figure, sitting in the dark, waiting as if they knew I'd see them. And sometimes, when the night is especially still and I'm alone on a quiet ride, I catch a glimpse of my reflection in the train window. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, I almost expect to see them there, sitting a few rows behind me, watching in silence, waiting for the moment when I finally turn around. Last winter, I rented a cabin by a lake for a much-needed retreat. The cabin was in a secluded area, surrounded by trees and with no neighbors for miles. It sounded like paradise. No distractions, no noise, just the peaceful sound of the wind through the trees and the soft lap of water against the shore. I spent my days reading by the fireplace, taking long walks by the frozen lake, and enjoying the solitude that was so rare back in the city. On the third night, I noticed something odd. It was around midnight, and I was reading in bed when I thought I heard faint footsteps outside. I brushed it off as the wind or perhaps an animal wandering by, but something about the sound felt too deliberate, too human. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then faded into the night. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing, but an uneasy feeling settled over me. The next morning I went outside to check. Snow had fallen the night before, covering the ground in a fresh, pristine layer. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed a single set of footprints leading from the tree line to the back of the cabin. They were small, like those of a child or a woman, and they stopped directly beneath my bedroom window before turning back toward the woods. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived, and there were no other cabins nearby. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself it was probably a hiker who had lost their way and had decided to check if the cabin was occupied. But the thought of someone standing outside my window in the dead of night filled me with a quiet dread that I couldn't shake. That night, I tried to sleep, but every creak of the cabin seemed amplified in the silence. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees sway. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, the same soft footsteps crunching through the snow outside. They were slow and unhurried, as if whoever was out there was taking their time. The footsteps stopped directly under my window. My heart pounded as I lay still, holding my breath, listening to the silence that followed. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind, but I knew better. I could feel the presence outside, feel the weight of eyes watching me from the darkness. I stayed motionless, hoping that whoever it was would leave, but the silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I didn't dare move, didn't even reach for the light. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps resumed, moving slowly around the cabin, circling it once before fading back toward the woods. When morning came, I went outside to check, half expecting the snow to be undisturbed, as if the whole thing had been a nightmare. But there they were, fresh footprints circling the cabin before disappearing into the trees. I considered leaving, but the cabin had been expensive, and I didn't want to let fear drive me away. I convinced myself that it was just a local playing a prank, someone trying to scare me for fun. But on the fifth night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer, as if whoever was out there wanted to make sure I knew they were there. I heard them stop at the front door, the faint sound of breathing just audible over the soft rustling of the wind. I could feel the tension building, a quiet dread that had me frozen in place. Then, without warning, the doorknob rattled, a soft, deliberate movement that made my blood run cold. Someone was trying to get inside. I stayed silent, barely breathing, hoping that they would give up and leave. But the rattling continued, slow and insistent, as though they were testing the lock, waiting for a sign of movement from within. My mind raced, and I mentally retraced every step from that day, trying to remember if I had locked all the windows and doors. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away from the door, and I heard them circle the cabin one last time before fading into the distance. I lay awake until dawn, every sound setting my nerves on edge, my mind racing with images of the shadowy figure lurking just beyond the walls. The next morning, I packed my things, unable to stand another night in the cabin. As I loaded my car, I looked back one last time, my gaze drawn to the snow-covered ground. The footprints were everywhere, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows, tracing a path that told a story of someone who had been watching, waiting, lurking just outside. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing by the cabin, watching me go. But the woods were empty, silent, as if nothing had happened. And yet, the image of those footprints, perfectly preserved in the snow, stayed with me, haunting my thoughts long after I had left the cabin behind. Even now, when I think back on that night, I can still hear the soft crunch of footsteps, the quiet presence that circled my sanctuary in the dead of winter, and the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching, waiting for me in the darkness. Last summer, I went camping alone, looking for some peace and quiet after a hectic few months. I set up my tent in a small clearing near the edge of a dense forest, far enough from any trails that I'd have complete solitude. The sun filtered gently through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground, and a light breeze carried the scent of pine and earth. It felt perfect. As night fell, the forest became pitch black, the quiet so deep it was almost as if the world had stopped breathing. The sounds of birds and insects faded, leaving only the occasional rustle of leaves. I sat by the small campfire, letting the crackling flames warm me, my mind wandering as I gazed into the darkness beyond. That's when I saw it, just beyond the glow of the fire, at the edge of the forest, a dark figure standing between the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, curious about the light. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized that it was shaped like a person, tall and thin, almost blending with the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just an outline, a presence that seemed to shift and sway with the flickering of the fire. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks on me. But every time I glanced up, the figure was still there, unmoving, watching from the darkness. A chill crept over me, and I suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable in the small circle of light that the fire provided. I forced myself to focus on my book, pretending not to notice, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the figure. The sense of being watched grew stronger, an oppressive weight that made the air feel thick, hard to breathe. I kept glancing at the edge of the forest, hoping the figure would disappear. But it didn't. Eventually, I doused the fire, hoping that the darkness would hide me, make me invisible to whatever was out there. I crawled into my tent, zipping it tightly and lying down, trying to convince myself that I was safe. But even with my eyes closed, I couldn't shake the feeling of that gaze, the cold presence just beyond the thin walls of the tent. Hours passed, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified, every whisper of wind a potential threat. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible footstep, followed by another, coming from the edge of the clearing. The steps were slow, deliberate, drawing closer with each second. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen, trying to control my breathing, afraid that even the slightest movement would reveal my presence. The footsteps paused, then continued, stopping just outside the tent. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, shallow and steady, barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tense as I waited for the intruder to leave. But the breathing continued, soft and slow, as though whoever, or whatever, was outside was standing mere inches from the fabric, listening, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps resumed, moving away from the tent and back toward the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too afraid to move, every nerve on edge, straining to hear any hint of the intruder's return. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent cautiously, peering outside. The clearing was empty, the forest silent. But just at the edge of the trees, in the soft morning light, I saw them, footprints deep and clear in the damp earth, leading from the edge of the forest to my tent, circling it once before disappearing back into the shadows. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I packed up my things, unwilling to spend another night there. As I left, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see that dark figure watching from the trees. But the forest was empty, quiet, as if nothing had ever been there. Even now, I can't shake the memory of that night, the feeling of being watched, hunted by something lurking just out of sight. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I feel that same presence, a shadow at the edge of my vision, waiting, watching, hidden just beyond the reach of the light. It was a quiet Sunday night, and I was alone in my apartment, enjoying the calm. My place was on the 5th floor, overlooking the city with a wide window that stretched almost the length of the room. I usually kept the blinds open to let in the city lights, enjoying the faint glow that spilled into the room. That night, the air was still, the city unusually silent. I had the window cracked open to let in a faint breeze, the sounds of distant traffic barely audible. As I was getting ready for bed, I felt an odd prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a quiet, nagging feeling that I was being watched. It was strange, unsettling, but I brushed it off, convincing myself that I was just tired. But the feeling grew stronger, more insistent, like a weight pressing down on me. My eyes drifted toward the window, half expecting to see nothing but the darkened cityscape. But instead, I saw it, a figure standing motionless just outside my window, staring straight at me. My heart froze. I could barely make out any details in the darkness, just the outline of a head, shoulders, and a dark figure blending into the night. It didn't move, didn't flinch, as if it had been there all along, waiting for me to notice. I was on the 5th floor. No balcony, no ledge wide enough to stand on. There was no way anyone should have been able to be there. The realization sent a chill through me, a deep, paralyzing fear that rooted me in place. I couldn't look away, my gaze locked on the shadowy figure, my mind racing through possible explanations. But nothing made sense. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a reflection, but I could see the faint outline of their eyes, dark and unblinking, focused intently on me. Finally, forcing myself to move, I stumbled backward, reaching for the switch to turn off the lights, hoping that darkness would hide me, make me invisible to whatever was out there. But as the room fell into shadow, I could still make out the figure, its form sharper now against the backdrop of the faint city lights. The figure leaned closer to the glass, and in the dim glow, I could see a hand press against the window pane, fingers splayed, leaving a faint, foggy imprint on the glass. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my body paralyzed by a cold terror as the figure continued to stare, their hands still pressed against the glass, unmoving. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, but I couldn't tear myself away from the sight. Finally, I gathered enough courage to back away slowly, inching toward the door. Just as I reached the doorway, I glanced back at the window one last time, heart pounding. The figure was gone. I stood there in the dark, listening to the silence, half expecting to hear a sound, a tap at the door, a creak from the window. But the apartment was silent, and the window now showed only the empty night sky and the faint glow of city lights. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the door, clutching my phone, waiting for the morning light to chase away the shadows. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself to go over to the window, heart pounding as I reached out to touch the glass. There, barely visible, was the faint outline of a handprint, pressed against the glass from the outside, exactly where the figure had been. For weeks, I avoided that window, keeping the blinds tightly shut, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching, waiting. Even now, I sometimes catch myself glancing at the blinds at night, half expecting to see a figure standing just beyond, staring back at me from the darkness, hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to look. It was an old house, a century-old Victorian with creaking floors and tall, narrow windows that let in only slivers of light. I'd recently moved in, drawn to its charm and character, even if it was a bit worn down. The house had a strange layout, with winding hallways and rooms that seemed oddly placed, as though they'd been added on at random over the years. One room in particular caught my attention when I moved in. It was at the end of a long hallway on the second floor, a small door with an ancient-looking lock that seemed out of place. The previous owner had left no key, and when I'd asked the real estate agent about it, she'd shrugged, saying it was probably just an old storage room. But something about that door unsettled me. Days passed, and I couldn't shake my curiosity. Every time I walked by, I felt an urge to try the handle, to find a way inside. One night, after hearing faint, unidentifiable noises from beyond the door, I decided to call a locksmith. The locksmith took one look at the door, hesitated, then told me he could open it but advised caution. I laughed it off, eager to finally satisfy my curiosity. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow room that looked untouched, as if it had been sealed for decades. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with an old, stale smell, mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. A faint metallic scent that set my nerves on edge. There was no furniture, just bare walls and a wooden floor. In the center of the room lay an old rug, worn and frayed, covering a large portion of the floor. I walked in, feeling the weight of silence settle over me, and pulled back the rug. Beneath it, scratched deep into the wood, was a large circle filled with symbols I didn't recognize. They were crudely carved, the lines uneven and chaotic, as if done by someone in a hurry or under duress. A chill crept over me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the markings. I took a few steps back, unnerved, and that's when I noticed something else, the faint sound of breathing. It was so soft I almost didn't hear it, like a gentle exhale, but unmistakable. I looked around, but the room was empty, completely devoid of anything that could produce such a sound. And yet, it continued, slow and rhythmic, as if someone were standing right next to me. The air grew colder, and a feeling of dread settled over me, a deep, primal fear that told me I shouldn't be in this room. My skin prickled, and every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, staring at the strange symbols on the floor, the sound of breathing filling the room, surrounding me. Then suddenly the door behind me swung shut, slamming with a force that rattled the walls. I ran to the door, twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The breathing grew louder, closer, echoing in the empty space around me, like something unseen was circling me, watching. I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but the room seemed to close in, the walls pressing closer, suffocating me in the darkness. The breathing was all I could hear, a low, haunting rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the floor, through my bones, filling my mind with an overwhelming sense of panic. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door swung open on its own. I stumbled out, gasping for air, the cold dread clinging to me as I scrambled down the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't look back, didn't dare to, afraid of what I might see if I did. In the days that followed, I couldn't bring myself to go near that room. I locked the door, barricading it with furniture, but every night I could feel its presence, hear the faint sound of breathing through the walls, as though the room itself were alive, waiting for me to return. I haven't been back inside that room since, but I know whatever is in there hasn't left. Late at night, I sometimes hear faint scratches at the door, whispers too quiet to understand, a reminder of the secrets hidden within those walls. And each night, I wonder if it's only a matter of time before the locked room calls me back, pulling me into its darkness, where the shadows breathe and something waits, unseen, for me to return. Hiking alone was something I'd always found refreshing, a chance to clear my mind and escape the routine. That weekend, I planned a solo trip to a forest trail I'd never explored before, known for its isolation and the dense, untouched beauty of its woods. I'd been assured by experienced hikers that the trail was straightforward, albeit remote, so I left early in the morning to make the most of the daylight. As I set off, I felt a calming silence surround me, interrupted only by the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional bird call. The trail was narrow, winding between towering trees that blocked most of the sunlight, casting deep shadows along my path. I felt at peace, glad to be far from civilization, even if I hadn't seen a single soul since I'd started. After a few hours of steady walking, I noticed a peculiar sensation, the feeling of being watched. I shrugged it off as paranoia, perhaps from the eeriness of the dense forest, but the feeling persisted, prickling the back of my neck. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see an animal in the bushes, but the trail behind me was empty, silent, with nothing but the shadowed path stretching back through the trees. Pushing the thought aside, I continued hiking, picking up my pace a little. But soon I saw something that made me pause. Just a few feet ahead, carved into the trunk of a tree, was a word, my name. It was crudely etched, almost scratched into the bark, the letters jagged as if done in a hurry. My skin prickled. I had never been on this trail before, and the thought of someone carving my name into a tree in such a secluded place felt deeply unsettling. I took a deep breath, chalking it up to coincidence. After all, it could have been anyone with the same name, right? I shook off the unease and kept walking. But no matter how I tried to calm myself, the silence now felt heavier, the trees looming darker around me. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky when I saw him, a stranger standing just off the trail, partially hidden behind a tree. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, only his outline. He was completely still, his head turned slightly toward me. My heart began to race, a pulse of fear shooting through me. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there as though he'd been waiting for me. I kept walking, forcing myself to act like I hadn't seen him, keeping my eyes focused ahead. But with each step, I could feel his gaze following me, the weight of it pressing down on me, making every instinct scream to run. I picked up my pace, my breathing shallow, the thrill of solitude now replaced with dread. As I moved further along the trail, the stranger disappeared from view, hidden behind the thick trees. But the sensation of being watched remained, stronger than before, a heavy presence that refused to let go. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, but the trail was always empty. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he was there, somewhere close, observing my every step. The path led me deeper into the forest, and soon the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the ground. I knew I needed to find my way back before darkness fully set in. As I turned to retrace my steps, I stopped cold. There, on the trunk of a tree directly in front of me, was another carving. It was my name again, followed by the date, today's date. My blood ran cold. This couldn't be a coincidence. My heart pounded, and I felt a chill wash over me, realizing that someone had been expecting me, someone who knew I would be here today. The stranger's face flashed through my mind, his stillness, his silent, watchful presence. I scanned my surroundings, hoping to spot some hint of movement, some explanation, but the forest was silent, as if holding its breath. I quickened my pace, desperately wanting to reach the trailhead and put this unnerving experience behind me. The shadows grew longer, and the path became harder to follow as daylight faded. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the stranger trailing behind me, but each time the path remained empty. Finally, I saw the trailhead up ahead, the edge of the forest, and my car parked in the distance. Relief washed over me, and I broke into a jog, eager to escape the suffocating quiet of the woods. But as I neared the end of the trail, something on the ground caught my eye. There, in the dirt, were footprints, deep, fresh, leading directly to the spot where I stood. They weren't mine. The footprints were larger, and they'd been made recently, the edges of each print clear and sharp. They started from the trailhead and went back into the forest, tracing the exact path I'd walked, as though someone had been following me the entire time. A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the stranger's figure in the distance. The forest was empty, but the silence felt unnatural, almost menacing, as though the trees themselves were hiding something from me. I hurried to my car, locking the doors as soon as I got inside. My heart raced, and as I started the engine, I forced myself not to look back, refusing to give in to the creeping sensation that I was still being watched. Driving away, I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it was just paranoia, a trick of my mind. But even now, I can still feel that stranger's gaze, a shadowed memory that lingers at the edges of my thoughts, making me wonder if he's still out there, waiting in the quiet depths of the forest, watching for the next hiker to pass by. It was just another ordinary day when I first noticed the package. I had returned home from work, exhausted as usual, and there it was, a small brown box resting on my front porch. It was plain, no address label, no return information, just a simple package tied neatly with a string. I didn't think much of it, assuming it had been mistakenly left by a courier, perhaps meant for a neighbor. So I left it there, expecting someone would claim it. The next morning, however, the package was still there, unmoved. I picked it up, feeling its weight. It was light, almost empty, but something inside shifted as I tilted it. I inspected it closely again. Still no markings, no note, nothing to indicate where it had come from or who it was for. A strange feeling washed over me, but I brushed it off, setting the package back on the porch, still convinced it would be picked up eventually. The following day, I came home to find the package had been moved slightly, just a few inches from where I had left it. I hesitated, a creeping unease settling over me as I looked around my quiet street. There was no sign of anyone else, no hint that someone had been there. I picked up the package again, now feeling strangely possessive over it, as if it were meant for me after all. I brought it inside, setting it on the table, but I didn't open it. Something in me resisted, as if opening the package would make it real, somehow binding me to it. Over the next few days, I started to forget about it, going about my routine, letting it sit unopened. But every time I passed by, I felt drawn to it. Finally, one night, after a long day at work, I decided to open it, if only to satisfy my own curiosity. Slowly, I untied the string and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in crumpled paper, was a small hand-sewn doll. The doll was crude, roughly stitched together with faded fabric, but its face was disturbingly familiar. It had my hair color, my eye color. Even my work clothes were eerily represented in the doll's stitching. My heart pounded as I stared at it, a chill creeping down my spine. I told myself it was impossible for this doll to resemble me, but the uncanny resemblance was undeniable. I quickly put the doll back in the box, closed the lid, and stuffed it into a cabinet, trying to convince myself it was some bizarre coincidence. But as the days passed, the feeling of unease grew, a quiet dread settling over my home. Every night, I felt compelled to check the cabinet just to make sure the box was still there, that the doll hadn't somehow moved. Then one evening, I came home to find another package on my doorstep, identical to the first. Plain, no address, no markings. My heart sank as I picked it up, feeling its familiar lightness, the slight shift of something inside. I took it inside, already knowing what I'd find. Sure enough, when I opened it, another doll lay inside, this one stitched in different clothes, an outfit I had worn just the day before. I could feel a creeping horror set in, my mind racing with questions and fears I couldn't explain. Someone was watching me, someone who knew my every move, and who was somehow creating these twisted representations of my life. I tried to ignore the package, placing it in the cabinet with the first doll, locking it up tight. But the feeling of being watched never left. I found myself glancing out my windows more often, checking the locks, searching for some sign of the person behind these dolls. The packages continued to arrive, each one containing a new doll, each wearing an outfit I had recently worn. Each night, the dread built until I could barely sleep, my mind haunted by the thought of someone meticulously crafting these dolls, studying me, knowing details only someone close to me should know. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft scraping sound outside my front door. My heart raced, my mind filling with images of whoever was leaving these packages. But I couldn't bring myself to check, too terrified of what, or who, I might find. The noise continued, a slow, deliberate sound, as if something was being dragged across the ground. And then silence. In the morning, I found another package on the doorstep, larger than the previous ones. My hands shook as I brought it inside, dreading what I would find. When I opened it, I felt my stomach turn. Inside was a life-size doll, dressed in an exact replica of my clothes from the previous day. The face was blank, yet I could feel an unblinking stare, as if it had been waiting for me. I tried calling the police, but there was little they could do. No prints, no clues, nothing but the eerie dolls that filled my cabinet, a growing collection that I couldn't bring myself to destroy. I tried to escape it, moved away, changed my routines, but the packages never stopped. Wherever I went, they appeared, each doll closer to capturing every detail of my life, as though whoever, or whatever, was creating them was drawing closer to some final version. Now, each time I leave my house, I can feel the weight of unseen eyes, feel the chill of knowing someone out there watches, knows, and will never stop. And every night, I can't help but wonder if one day, I'll find a doll that isn't a reflection of my past, but of something yet to come. Traveling alone had its charms, but it also had its fair share of uneasy moments. One night, while on a road trip, I decided to stay at a small roadside motel. It wasn't much, just a faded sign and a cluster of rooms around a cracked asphalt parking lot. The whole place had a forgotten look, as if it had been waiting too long for guests who never arrived. But it was late and I was too exhausted to keep driving. The clerk barely looked up as I checked in, his expression blank and disinterested as he handed me a key. Room 104. The room was at the far end of the lot, a fact that I didn't fully appreciate until I parked and realized just how isolated it felt, tucked away in the corner of the property. It was unnervingly quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the distant highway and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Inside, the room was clean enough, though the smell of mildew lingered in the air. The walls were a dull beige, peeling slightly at the corners, and the lights flickered faintly as I switched them on. I set my bag down, trying to ignore the feeling of emptiness that seemed to permeate the room, as though it hadn't been occupied in years. After a quick shower, I got into bed, hoping to get a good night's rest before the long drive ahead. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I began to hear faint sounds, quiet, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. It was a soft, shuffling noise, like footsteps moving slowly outside my door. I told myself it was just another guest passing by, perhaps on their way to the vending machine or looking for the ice bucket. But as the minutes passed, the footsteps didn't fade. They lingered, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth in front of my door. The longer I listened, the more uneasy I felt. There was something strange about the rhythm of the steps, a kind of aimless, repetitive quality that didn't seem like the movements of a fellow guest. I pulled the covers up to my chin, straining to hear, but the footsteps continued, soft but persistent, echoing in the stillness of the night. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore it, telling myself that it didn't matter, that it was probably nothing. But then the footsteps stopped, right outside my door. A silence followed, deep and absolute, as if the whole motel was holding its breath. My pulse quickened as I lay there, frozen, waiting for the sound to return, but there was only silence. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, and I began to convince myself that whoever it was had moved on. But just as I started to relax, there was a soft knock at the door. It was faint, almost hesitant, as if whoever was out there was unsure whether they should knock at all. I felt a chill creep over me, an instinctive fear that told me not to open the door, not to even acknowledge the knock. The knock came again, a little louder this time, still soft but insistent. I lay there, motionless, my breath shallow as I tried to decide what to do. But something in me knew that opening the door was the last thing I should do. I stayed still, hoping that whoever it was would leave, that they would give up and go away. But the knocking didn't stop. It continued, a slow, rhythmic tap that seemed to resonate through the entire room. I could feel each knock in my bones, a quiet but relentless sound that seemed to draw closer with each beat. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't there. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking finally stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more unnerving, a thick, oppressive stillness that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I lay there, heart pounding, listening for any sign of movement, but the quiet stretched on, unbroken and absolute. Just as I started to believe it was over, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching, as if something was brushing against the door from the outside. It was faint but persistent, a quiet scraping that seemed to come from all around me, filling the room with a chilling sense of unease. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, moving along the length of the door as if someone, or something, was tracing their fingers across it. I held my breath, my eyes wide open in the darkness, too afraid to move, too terrified to even blink. The sound was everywhere, surrounding me, filling the silence with an unrelenting dread. I don't know how long I lay there, trapped in that horrible silence, but eventually the scratching stopped. The silence returned, deeper and more oppressive than before, and I found myself too paralyzed with fear to even check the door. I waited until the first light of dawn seeped through the window, and only then did I muster the courage to get out of bed. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see some sign of whoever had been outside, but the parking lot was empty, bathed in the early morning light. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone having been there at all. The only evidence was a faint smudge on the door, a long, dark streak that ran along the surface as though someone had dragged their fingers across it. I left the motel as quickly as I could, my heart racing as I drove away, desperate to leave that place behind. Even now, I can't shake the memory of that night, the quiet footsteps, the insistent knocking, the scratching that seemed to seep into my bones. I still find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, just outside my door, waiting in silence. It was winter, and I had planned a short trip to the mountains to unwind. I'd rented a cozy cabin far from town, hoping to escape the noise and find some peace in the isolation of the snow-covered forest. The first day passed quietly, the world outside a blanket of white, with fresh snow falling steadily through the trees. The silence was almost tangible, the only sounds being the faint crunch of my boots in the snow and the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. The next morning, I decided to explore a nearby trail I'd read about online. I dressed warmly, grabbing a thermos of coffee, and set off into the woods, leaving the cabin behind me. The trail was deserted, the path winding through tall pines and blanketed in pristine snow. The quiet was immense, filling every corner of the forest, making even the smallest sound feel amplified. After about an hour of walking, I decided to take a break. I found a large rock and brushed off the snow, sitting down to drink my coffee and take in the view. The snow was mesmerizing, glistening under the weak winter sunlight, and I lost myself in the silence, feeling more at peace than I had in ages. But then something strange caught my eye. A few feet away, just barely visible in the untouched snow, was a faint imprint, a face. The snow around it was smooth and undisturbed, but the shape of the face was unmistakable, as though someone had been lying there, pressed into the snow, staring straight up at the sky. I walked closer, squinting to make out the details. The face was slightly elongated, the contours soft yet eerily defined, with the impression of hollow eyes and a faint suggestion of a mouth. A chill ran down my spine. There was no sign of footprints around it, no evidence that anyone had been nearby to make the imprint. The face was simply there, perfectly formed in the snow, staring up at me. I felt an inexplicable dread, the kind that creeps up on you slowly, filling you with an unease that defies logic. I told myself it was just a coincidence, a strange formation caused by the snow or the way it had settled, and forced myself to move on. But every few minutes I found myself glancing back, expecting to see that face in the snow following me somehow, or perhaps catching a glimpse of it peeking through the trees. As I continued along the trail, the silence grew heavier, as if the forest itself was watching me, each step echoing in the oppressive quiet. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the snow, and I knew I should head back soon. But before I turned around, I looked back one last time, and froze. There, on the trail behind me, was another face in the snow. This one was even closer, more defined, with the hollow impressions of eyes staring directly in my direction. The mouth seemed to have stretched slightly, almost as if it was beginning to form a smile. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I took a step back, my mind racing. I was certain that no one else was out here, that there had been no time for someone to create this second face. I turned back, trying to shake off the fear that had settled over me. The trail back to the cabin felt longer than it had before, the shadows stretching out and filling the spaces between the trees. I kept glancing over my shoulder, each time expecting to see that face again, or perhaps someone standing silently in the snow watching. When I finally reached the cabin, I bolted the door behind me, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. But as I looked out the window, surveying the path leading up to the cabin, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, right outside, was another imprint in the snow, another face staring up at me with that hollow, unblinking gaze. It was positioned exactly where I had stopped earlier that morning, as though it had followed me back from the forest. I closed the curtains, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light or a coincidence. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, the quiet of the cabin now filled with an oppressive weight, as if the face in the snow was still out there, waiting. That night, I barely slept, every sound amplified in the silence. At one point, I thought I heard faint scratching at the window, but when I gathered the courage to look, there was nothing there, just darkness stretching out endlessly over the snowy landscape. I forced myself to close my eyes, trying to ignore the gnawing dread that had taken hold of me. In the morning, I cautiously opened the door, my breath fogging in the cold air. The imprint was still there, but now it was joined by several more, each one leading from the woods directly toward the cabin. forming a path of faces in the snow, each staring up with that same hollow expression. They were perfectly spaced, as if someone, or something, had carefully pressed them into the snow, one by one, watching my every move. I packed up and left the cabin as quickly as I could, my mind reeling as I drove away, leaving the faces behind me. Even now, months later, I can still see them in my mind, a line of hollow-eyed faces staring up from the snow, as if waiting for me to return. Working the night shift as a security guard in an office building seemed easy enough. I was alone most nights, my only company being the banks of monitors displaying feeds from various cameras throughout the building. Most nights were routine. A few patrols through the dark, empty hallways and then back to the security room to watch over the silent spaces on screen. It was dull, but I liked the predictability of it. One night, as I settled into my usual routine, something unusual caught my eye on one of the monitors. In a far corner of the building, just outside a storage room on the 3rd floor, there was a figure standing motionless, facing away from the camera. The person was standing under a dim light, barely visible. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the figure was mostly hidden in shadow. At first, I thought it was just a cleaner or maybe a late-working employee, but it struck me as odd that they were standing so still. I watched for a minute, expecting them to move or turn, but they didn't. They remained in that same spot, facing the wall, unmoving. Unease crept in, but I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just someone lost in thought. After a few minutes, I decided to investigate. I took the elevator up, feeling the quiet of the building pressing down on me as I approached the 3rd floor corridor. When I arrived, the hall was empty. I checked the storage room and nearby offices, but everything was in place and there was no sign of anyone. Shrugging it off, I returned to the security room, convincing myself I'd been mistaken or that the person had simply left while I was on my way up. Later that night, I glanced at the monitor again and my stomach dropped. The figure was back, standing in the exact same spot, facing the wall just as before. A shiver ran through me. I kept my eyes on the screen, watching closely, but they didn't move. I tried to zoom in on the camera, but the details remained blurry, the figure half shrouded in darkness. As I stared, a terrible realization dawned on me. The figure seemed slightly wrong. The proportions were just a bit off. The arms too long, the shoulders slumped unnaturally. I felt my skin crawl, an instinctual fear bubbling up. My pulse quickened and I checked the other monitors, hoping it was a trick of the light. But there was nothing on the other screens. It was only that one feed, that one shadowed figure standing silently in the dark. Hours passed, and though I tried to ignore it, my eyes kept drifting back to the monitor. At one point, I blinked and the figure was gone. A wave of relief washed over me, though a part of me still felt unsettled. I told myself I was just tired, that maybe the footage had glitched, creating an illusion. But deep down, I knew it hadn't been a mistake. Over the next few nights, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked at that particular camera feed, I half expected to see the figure reappear. For a few nights, nothing unusual happened, and I began to relax, telling myself it had just been a random occurrence, a trick of my exhausted mind. But then, one night, as I glanced up at the screen, I saw the figure again. This time, they were closer, standing in the hallway outside the elevator on the 3rd floor, still facing away from the camera. My heart pounded as I watched, frozen in place. The figure was standing almost directly beneath the camera, close enough that I could make out the vague outline of a head and shoulders. The unnatural proportions were even more pronounced. The figure's limbs seemed elongated, twisted in a way that didn't quite make sense. I sat there, paralyzed, watching as the figure remained perfectly still. And then, slowly, they turned, just enough for me to glimpse a faint, pale face half hidden in shadow, its eyes wide and staring directly at the camera. The sight sent a wave of terror through me, an inexplicable feeling that whatever was looking at me wasn't human. I couldn't tear my eyes away as the figure stood there, staring back at me through the screen. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and my fingers trembled as I gripped the edge of the desk. It felt as though the figure could see me, knew that I was watching, and that they were watching me in return. Suddenly, the screen flickered, the image distorting momentarily. When it cleared, the figure was gone. I sat there, shaken, unable to move, staring at the empty hallway on the monitor. The rest of the night passed in a blur, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer, fears I couldn't shake. I tried to tell myself it was a glitch, a trick of the security feed, but deep down, I knew that whatever I'd seen was real. And worse, I knew it wasn't over. The next night, I found myself glancing at the third-floor monitor constantly, dreading the moment I might see that figure again. And soon enough, it returned. Every night after that, the figure appeared somewhere new on the third floor, always facing away, its shape distorted and unnatural. It was as though it was slowly moving closer to the security room, inch by inch, each night getting nearer. On my last night working that shift, I saw the figure one final time. It was standing directly outside the door to the security room, its shadow stretching across the floor, visible through the small window. I didn't dare open the door. I waited, paralyzed with fear, until dawn finally broke. I quit the job the next day. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but I knew I could never go back to that building, never look at those monitors again. And sometimes, late at night, I still see that face in my mind, staring, waiting, always watching, like a nightmare that never quite leaves. Late nights often found me on the last train home. The carriage was usually empty, save for a few scattered commuters lost in their own worlds, half asleep or with eyes glazed over, staring out into the darkness. It had become routine. I would board, find an empty seat near the back, and settle in, hoping to catch a few minutes of rest before my stop. One night, as the train rolled into the station, I noticed it was emptier than usual. I stepped inside and made my way to my usual seat, enjoying the silence as the doors slid shut and the train pulled away. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic click of the tracks became a comforting background, and I leaned back, letting the movement lull me. But something felt off. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, just an odd prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I glanced around and noticed a figure seated at the far end of the carriage. A man sitting stiffly, his gaze fixed straight ahead. His posture was unnaturally rigid, his face shadowed beneath the dim lights. Though he sat perfectly still, I felt as if he were somehow aware of me, as though his gaze was cutting through the darkness directly toward me. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was nothing, just another commuter lost in his thoughts. But as the train passed through the tunnels, the shadows shifted, and I caught brief glimpses of his face. Pale, expressionless, his eyes wide open, staring unblinkingly at the empty air in front of him. There was something unsettling about the way he sat, too still, too quiet, as though he were more statue than man. As the train sped through one of the darker sections of the route, the lights flickered briefly, casting strange patterns across the carriage. In that split second, I could have sworn the man's face had changed direction, angled just slightly toward me, his eyes dark and unyielding. My heart pounded, and I quickly averted my gaze, focusing on the worn fabric of the seat in front of me. But the feeling of being watched persisted, a heavy presence pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. I tried to distract myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I could feel his eyes on me. When we stopped at the next station, I thought about getting off, waiting for the next train. But the doors remained closed, the platform deserted. The train resumed its journey, and I forced myself to look back, expecting to see the man in the same position, staring blankly ahead. But he had moved. He was now sitting a few rows closer, his body turned slightly, his eyes unmistakably fixed on me. I froze, my mind racing, trying to remember if I had heard him move, if there had been any sound at all. But there had been nothing, only the quiet hum of the train and the dim light casting eerie shadows across his face. I shifted uncomfortably, my skin prickling with fear as I tried to avert my gaze. But the man's presence was impossible to ignore, his eyes unblinking, his face pale and expressionless. He seemed to blend into the shadows, becoming a part of the darkness that filled the train, and I could feel his gaze penetrating, as though he could see every fear I tried to suppress. With each stop, the carriage remained empty, the doors opening to reveal silent, deserted platforms. No one else boarded, and the man remained in his seat, watching. Each time I glanced back, he was closer, his face inches nearer, the shadows around him growing darker, deeper, pulling him into an endless void. When my stop finally approached, I could barely contain my relief. I stood up, clutching my bag, and hurried toward the doors, avoiding looking in his direction. But as I reached the end of the carriage, I glanced back one last time, needing to confirm that he was still seated, still watching. But he was gone. The seat was empty, the space where he had sat now a hollow void. My pulse quickened, and I stumbled back, half expecting him to appear out of the shadows. I looked around, but the train was empty. A cold, creeping dread washed over me, filling me with a terror I couldn't explain. The doors slid open, and I stepped out onto the platform, my breath catching in the cold night air. I turned, looking back at the carriage, half expecting to see him staring at me from the window. But the carriage was dark, empty, as if he had never been there at all. As the train pulled away, I remained rooted to the spot, watching it disappear into the tunnel, the memory of the man's unblinking gaze haunting me. Even now, I can still see his face in my mind, pale and expressionless, waiting in the shadows of the empty train, forever watching. When I moved into my new apartment, it was with the hope of finding a fresh start. The place was small, old, and a bit worn around the edges, but it had character. It was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood with thick walls that muted the outside noise. The previous tenant had left a few items behind, including an old, bulky wardrobe that sat against the wall in the bedroom. The wardrobe was locked when I first tried to open it. Its wooden doors were warped with age, and I assumed the lock was just jammed, perhaps rusted from years of neglect. I didn't give it much thought. I planned to get rid of it anyway. For the first few days, it was just another piece of old furniture taking up space, a heavy and unmovable reminder of the apartment's past. On my first night in the apartment, I awoke to a soft clicking noise. I sat up, disoriented in the dark, my mind struggling to make sense of the sound. It was coming from the wardrobe. The steady, quiet tapping continued, a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, like fingers drumming against wood. I told myself it was just the building settling, the old wardrobe expanding and contracting with the cool night air, and forced myself back to sleep. But each night the tapping returned, soft and patient. I'd wake up at odd hours, listening to the faint sound echoing through the darkness. It grew louder each night, a repetitive noise that made my skin crawl. I would lie there, heart pounding, as the clicking continued from behind those locked doors. One morning, I tried to pry the doors open, frustrated by the constant noise that was disturbing my sleep. But they wouldn't budge. The lock was solid, as if it hadn't been touched in years. I pulled harder, tried to shake it loose, but it felt as though something on the other side was holding it closed. A few days later, I decided to sleep in the living room, hoping to escape the unnerving sound. But in the middle of the night, the tapping began again, distant but unmistakable, echoing from the bedroom as if it was following me. It was relentless, scratching at my nerves, a quiet reminder that something was locked away just a few feet from where I slept. The turning point came one evening as I was getting ready for bed. I glanced at the wardrobe, dreading the noise I knew would come. But as I watched, something changed. The faint outline of the wardrobe's doors seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, as though someone on the other side was pressing against it, pushing out, testing the lock. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and a small screwdriver, determined to pry open the lock and end this nightmare. The flashlight's beam was unsteady, casting shadows that made the room feel colder, darker. I approached the wardrobe slowly, heart pounding, feeling a chill settle in my bones as I reached for the lock. But just as I placed the screwdriver against it, the wardrobe shifted slightly. The movement was so small that at first I thought I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate click as though someone were trying to unlock the door from the inside. I stumbled back, a wave of dread washing over me as I realized that whatever was inside was trying to get out. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was locked inside was growing impatient. I backed away, feeling a deep, instinctual fear that kept me from turning away. I watched in horror as the door shuddered slightly, the sound of metal grinding against wood, the lock rattling as if being tested from the other side. I slept with the lights on that night, every small creak of the apartment sending a chill down my spine. When morning finally came, I made a decision. I would get rid of the wardrobe, get it out of my apartment, whatever it took. I couldn't bear another night of that sound, of feeling that presence pressing against the locked door, waiting. When the movers arrived, I watched as they struggled to lift the wardrobe, its weight far heavier than I had anticipated. As they tipped it to carry it out, a single object fell from beneath, something that had been wedged between the wardrobe and the floorboards. I reached down to pick it up, a small, tarnished key cold to the touch. I stood there holding the key, my mind racing. The answer to the locked door had been here all along, hidden just out of sight. Part of me wanted to use it, to finally see what was inside, to put an end to the mystery once and for all. But a stronger part of me felt that the unknown was better left sealed, that some things were meant to remain locked away. I slipped the key into my pocket, telling myself I'd forget about it, that I didn't need to know. I watched as the movers carried the wardrobe out of my apartment, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders as it disappeared down the stairs. But even now, every once in a while, I find myself reaching into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the key. And every night as I lie in bed, I half expect to hear that familiar tapping sound, echoing through the silence, as if the wardrobe's presence had never truly left. It had become a ritual for me to take a walk each evening, a way to unwind and clear my mind. The park near my apartment was small, but quiet and peaceful, and by the time I got there, it was usually empty. A few dim street lamps lined the path, casting faint circles of light over the pavement. My favorite part of the walk was a solitary bench under a large, twisted oak tree. It had a view of the small pond nearby and was the perfect spot to sit, think, and breathe in the evening air. One night, as I approached the bench, I felt an odd chill run down my spine. The park was empty as usual, but something about the darkness felt heavier, as though it was hiding something. I brushed off the feeling, chalking it up to the cold, and sat down on the bench, letting the familiar creak of the wood settle around me. As I sat there, I felt an odd sensation like someone was nearby, watching. I glanced around but saw nothing, only the faint outline of trees and the shimmering reflection of the pond under the moonlight. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was all in my head, a trick of the shadows. The next night, the feeling returned, stronger this time. It lingered as I walked down the path, the air feeling colder, sharper. When I reached the bench, I hesitated, feeling an irrational fear that hadn't been there before. But once again, I forced myself to sit, determined not to let my imagination ruin my routine. As I sat, I caught sight of something unusual on the ground in front of the bench. In the soft dirt, there was an impression, a shallow outline, almost like the shape of someone sitting, leaning slightly forward as if they had been watching something intently. The hair on my arm stood up as I looked at it, but I quickly brushed it off as nothing more than a strange coincidence. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. The following night, I approached the bench more cautiously, my nerves fraying with each step. The park was as quiet as ever, but something about the air felt different, more tense. When I reached the bench, I stopped, my heart pounding as I noticed a figure sitting on the far end of it. They were facing away from me, their body leaning slightly forward, just as the imprint in the dirt had suggested. I couldn't see their face or make out any details, but they were completely still, almost too still, blending into the darkness as though they were a part of it. I felt a strange compulsion to sit, as if an invisible force was pulling me toward the empty space beside them. Slowly, I lowered myself onto the bench, sitting as far as possible from the figure, my mind racing with questions. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, just sat in that same unnatural stillness, its gaze fixed straight ahead. I stayed only a few minutes before the fear became too much. I rose quickly, the bench creaking beneath me, and walked away, feeling the weight of that unblinking presence behind me. I didn't look back, my every step punctuated by the unsettling feeling that I was being followed, that whatever was on that bench had somehow latched onto me. The next day, I tried to shake off the memory, convincing myself it was a figment of my imagination, a shadow or a trick of the dim light. But as evening approached, I felt an irrational pull to return to the park, to see if the figure was still there. I resisted, but the thought gnawed at me, drawing me back. When I finally returned that night, I was alone. The bench was empty, but as I walked closer, I noticed something carved into the wood where I'd sat. It was a faint outline, but unmistakably the shape of a person, etched into the surface of the bench as if marking my presence. And next to it, carved in thin, barely visible lines, was another figure, sitting beside the first, mirroring the exact spot where the figure had sat the night before. I stepped back, my stomach twisting with fear. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the park was empty, silent, as if it had never held a soul. Yet the outline remained, a quiet reminder of the strange figure who had shared my bench. From that night on, I avoided the park, unable to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still waiting there, sitting in that same spot, watching, waiting for me to return. And sometimes, on dark, quiet nights, I find myself drawn back, wondering if I'll find my own outline, etched into the wood, next to that silent figure. I was driving home late at night after a long day of work. The roads were empty, and the darkness seemed to swallow the light from my headlights. My phone's GPS was guiding me along a familiar route when it suddenly glitched, the screen flickering as it recalculated a new path. I frowned, puzzled, but followed the new directions, assuming it was redirecting me due to traffic or a roadblock. The new route led me onto a winding back road I had never taken before. It was narrow and lined with tall, looming trees that seemed to close in around me, blocking out what little moonlight there was. I glanced down at the GPS, noticing the faint, pulsing glow of the map, and wondered if this was a shortcut. My instincts told me to turn back, but the road was too narrow to do so easily. So I kept driving, hoping I'd rejoin the main road soon. As I continued, the GPS began recalculating again, rerouting me deeper and deeper into the unknown road. The further I drove, the more unsettling the surroundings became. The trees were dense and twisted, their shadows casting eerie shapes along the road. The GPS spoke in its usual calm tone, instructing me to take turns that led me deeper into unfamiliar terrain. I tried switching it off, but it wouldn't respond, stuck on its determined path. I grew increasingly uneasy. I hadn't seen another car or any sign of civilization for miles, and the road was narrowing, barely wide enough for my car. After about 15 minutes of driving, I finally saw a faint light up ahead. A house, maybe, or a roadside diner. Relieved, I continued toward it, eager to turn off this unsettling path and ask for directions back to the main road. But as I got closer, my stomach twisted. The light illuminated a large, abandoned building, an old farmhouse, its windows shattered, and its structure leaning precariously to one side. The GPS instructed me to turn into the driveway, but everything in me screamed to keep driving, to ignore the voice that insisted I stop here. I tried to switch off the GPS again, but it continued speaking, urging me to pull into the driveway, its tone now strangely insistent. The map displayed the farmhouse as though it were a regular destination, its outline clear and precise on the screen, with a small label reading destination. My heart pounded as I sat there, staring at the crumbling building. The longer I stayed, the heavier the air felt, like an unseen weight pressing down on me, urging me to leave. But before I could shift into reverse, the GPS recalculated again, this time directing me to drive around to the back of the farmhouse. Against my better judgment, I followed the instructions, inching along the overgrown gravel path around the side of the house. The headlights cast long shadows over the windows, revealing dark shapes that seemed to move just out of sight. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting fear get the best of me. Then the GPS screen flickered and the map zoomed in on a particular spot, a small clearing just behind the house. "You have arrived," it announced in a cold, mechanical voice, the usual warmth gone, replaced by an almost sinister tone. As I stopped the car, my headlights illuminated the clearing, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There, in the middle of the grass, was a dark patch, something that looked like disturbed earth, as though something had recently been dug up. I couldn't understand why the GPS had led me here, to this desolate place, and why it was so insistent. The urge to leave became overwhelming. I shifted the car into reverse, my hands shaking, my mind screaming to get out of there. But as I backed away, the GPS screen went dark for a moment, then flashed back on. The map was gone, replaced by a single message displayed in bold, white letters. "Don't leave yet." My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the screen, frozen in place. The message remained, glowing ominously in the dark car. I tried shutting off my phone, but it wouldn't respond, as if locked onto that eerie command. Finally, desperation overcame fear, and I hit the gas, ignoring the GPS as I sped down the gravel path, back toward the main road. The car jolted over bumps and rocks, the headlights casting wild shadows across the trees, but I didn't look back. I just kept driving, my pulse racing, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. Eventually, the gravel turned to pavement, and I found myself back on a familiar road. The GPS had returned to its normal display, the map once again showing my route home. I breathed a sigh of relief, half laughing at myself for getting so worked up. But as I glanced down at the screen one last time, my heart stopped. There, faint but unmistakable, was a red pin marking the abandoned farmhouse, labeled with 2 words, "You're next." I slammed the phone face down, refusing to look at it again for the rest of the drive home. Even now, the memory of that night haunts me, the feeling that I'd been drawn somewhere I was never meant to find, never meant to escape. And every time my GPS glitches or recalculates, I can't help but wonder if it's trying to take me back, leading me towards something that waits in the darkness, at the end of a lonely, forgotten road. I often rode my bike at night. There was something calming about the quiet roads, the cool air rushing past, and the solitude of riding with nothing but my thoughts. My usual route took me through a winding back road on the outskirts of town, bordered by dense woods on either side. It was a peaceful stretch, usually deserted at that hour, and I enjoyed the sense of freedom it gave me. One night, as I pedaled down the familiar path, I noticed something unusual. Glancing into my side mirror, I saw a figure in the distance, another cyclist, his outline faint but unmistakable. It was strange. Few people took this route during the day, let alone at night. I assumed he was another night rider like me, enjoying the solitude, and thought nothing more of it. As I continued, I noticed that the figure was getting closer, slowly but steadily gaining on me. I felt a pang of annoyance at the thought of someone tailing me in such an isolated place, disturbing the solitude I sought on these rides. I picked up my pace, trying to put some distance between us, but no matter how hard I pedaled, he stayed right there in my mirror, his form dark and looming, never dropping back. The distance between us remained constant, close enough to make me feel his presence, but far enough that I couldn't make out any details. I found myself glancing into the mirror more often than watching the road ahead, my mind racing with questions. Why was he following me? How was he keeping up so effortlessly? I turned my head briefly, hoping to get a better look, but the road behind was empty. No one was there. My heart skipped a beat and I quickly looked back at my mirror. There he was again, his dark figure clear and distinct, moving in sync with me. A chill crept over me as I realized that no matter how I looked, he was only visible in the mirror, as though he existed solely within that small frame, a shadow bound to follow but never truly there. I forced myself to focus on the road, feeling my heart pound harder with each pedal stroke, my breath shallow as the night closed in around me. I kept riding, trying to ignore the figure, but the mirror drew my gaze like a magnet. Each time I looked, he was there, riding at a steady pace, his posture unchanging, his face obscured by shadows. A creeping dread settled over me, an instinctual fear that told me to get away, to lose him somehow. I pushed myself faster, ignoring the burning in my legs, desperate to leave him behind. But no matter how hard I rode, he never fell back, never grew smaller in the mirror. He was always there, an ever-present shadow that clung to me with an unnatural persistence. The road ahead felt endless, stretching on as though it had no end, trapping me with this silent, unyielding pursuer. I finally reached a turn and veered off onto a different road, one that led back toward town. I glanced back one last time, hoping to see the empty road, to prove that it had all been a trick of the mind. But he was still there, rounding the turn effortlessly, maintaining the exact same distance. Panic surged through me as I raced down the new road, the familiar landmarks now seeming foreign, distorted in the darkness. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears, loud and labored, drowning out the quiet hum of my tires on the pavement. I refused to look in the mirror, afraid of what I'd see, afraid that he'd be even closer, close enough to reach out and touch. Finally, the lights of town came into view, and I felt a surge of relief, as if the lights themselves could protect me, drive away whatever haunted my mirror. I crossed into the first well-lit street, coasting to a stop under the glow of a street lamp. Heart pounding, I glanced into my mirror, my pulse racing as I expected to see him there, watching me from the edge of the darkness. But he was gone. The road behind was empty, just a deserted stretch of pavement disappearing into the shadows. I let out a shaky breath, my entire body tense with residual fear. It was over. I was safe. As I turned to head home, something compelled me to glance at the mirror one last time, just to reassure myself that he was truly gone. But as I looked, I saw him, his figure faint, barely visible, lurking just at the edge of the street lamp's light. He was still there, waiting at the edge of the dark road, his presence lingering like a specter bound to follow. Now, every time I ride, I can't help but check the mirror, expecting to see that familiar shape in the distance. I know he's out there, somewhere on those quiet roads, always keeping pace, always waiting, ready to return the moment I look back. I had just moved into a new apartment, a small one-bedroom in an older building with its fair share of quirks. It was quiet, the kind of place where tenants kept to themselves, and that suited me fine. The basement, however, had an odd reputation. I'd overheard the landlord mentioning that people didn't like to go down there, something about a draft and old, winding pipes that made unsettling noises. I didn't think much of it, though, until I began noticing things out of place in my apartment. At first, it was subtle. A cup moved from where I'd left it, a book that had shifted position, or lights left on that I was certain I'd turned off. I chalked it up to forgetfulness or blamed it on the wind from the drafty windows. But as the days passed, the disturbances became more frequent. I'd find drawers half open, cabinets I knew I'd closed slightly ajar. The uneasy feeling that someone else had been there, touching my things, settled over me. I told myself it was just paranoia. After all, I was the only one with the key to my apartment. Then one night I heard a sound. It was faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps coming from below my floor, right beneath my bed. It was slow and deliberate, as if someone were pacing. I froze, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps continued, soft but persistent, pacing back and forth. The footsteps stopped just as suddenly as they'd started, leaving me in silence. I tried to convince myself it was just the pipes or maybe an echo from a neighbor's apartment. But a chill crept over me, the kind that seeps into your bones, making it impossible to shake the feeling of being watched. A few nights later, I heard the noise again. This time, it was louder, the footsteps moving directly beneath me, right under the floorboards. It was as if someone was walking back and forth, tracing a path that mirrored my own room's layout. My heart pounded as I lay there, my mind racing with explanations. The building was old, I reminded myself. Sounds traveled strangely. But when I mentioned it to the landlord, he grew pale, mumbling something about the basement tenant. He dismissed it quickly, saying it was nothing to worry about, and brushed me off before I could ask further questions. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check out the basement myself. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the narrow stairwell, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was dimly lit, with rows of storage units lining the walls, their rusted metal doors closed and padlocked. The air was thick, stale, carrying a faint, metallic scent that I couldn't quite place. As I walked further in, my flashlight caught something unusual, a narrow door at the very end of the basement, tucked behind an old boiler. Unlike the other doors, this one had no lock, only a faint, smudged outline of what looked like a handprint near the handle. I felt a strange compulsion to open it, to see what was inside. I turned the knob, the door creaking loudly as it swung open, revealing a small, empty room. At first, it seemed like just another storage area, but as I scanned the floor, something caught my eye. A scattering of personal items, all things I recognized. A cup, a book, and a few other small things I hadn't seen in weeks. My stomach twisted as I realized they were all items that had disappeared from my apartment. I glanced around, the beam of my flashlight flickering across the bare walls, and that's when I noticed the writing. Scrawled on the walls in faint, faded pencil were the words, "I'm here. I'm watching." My blood ran cold as I backed away, my heart racing. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard it again. The soft sound of footsteps, echoing from just beyond the small room, as if someone were pacing back and forth in the darkness. Panic seized me, and I bolted up the stairs, locking my apartment door behind me. I sat there in the silence, every creak and groan of the building filling me with dread. That night, I barely slept, too afraid of what might be lurking beneath me, pacing back and forth. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about the basement, to convince myself it had all been some elaborate prank or a figment of my imagination. But the disturbances continued. I'd return home to find my things moved, a faint imprint on the floor as if someone had been standing in the middle of my living room. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the footsteps again. They were louder, closer, and this time they didn't stay in the basement. I could hear them moving up the stairwell, one slow step at a time, drawing closer to my apartment. I held my breath, too terrified to move as the footsteps stopped just outside my door. I waited, my heart pounding, listening to the silence that followed. Finally, I forced myself to get up, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty, the silence stretching on. But the sense of being watched was stronger than ever, a feeling that lingered, filling my apartment with an unshakable dread. I moved out soon after that, unable to bear the constant feeling that I was never truly alone, that someone, or something, was watching, waiting in the shadows beneath the floor. Even now, I can still hear those footsteps in my mind, that slow, deliberate pacing that echoed through the walls, a reminder of the basement tenant who never left. I worked the night shift at a large office complex, the kind that emptied out by 6 o'clock, leaving only a handful of people in the entire building. My shift often ended close to midnight, and by then the parking lot was a quiet, dimly lit expanse of asphalt, with only a few remaining cars scattered throughout. One evening as I was walking to my car, I noticed an old rusted sedan parked a few rows over. It wasn't the kind of car you'd expect to see in this area, where everyone drove newer models. It looked abandoned, with peeling paint, a cracked windshield, and windows fogged over with grime. I thought it was odd but didn't give it much more thought. After all, the complex was open to the public during the day, and I assumed someone had left it there temporarily. But the next night, the car was still there, parked in the exact same spot. I noticed it because I had parked just a few spaces over, and as I passed, I felt an odd, unexplainable chill. I glanced over, half expecting to see someone sitting inside, but the car was empty. Its interior was dark, and I could just barely make out the cluttered mess on the seats. A collection of old yellowing papers and what looked like children's toys, faded and broken. The following week, I continued to notice the car every night as I left work. It never moved, always parked in the same spot, as if it had been forgotten entirely. But every time I passed by, I felt that strange chill, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was nothing more than an old, abandoned car. But there was something about it that made me uneasy, something that felt wrong. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I lingered near the car, peering through the grimy windows. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty interior. The seats were torn, the dashboard cracked, and the floor littered with scraps of paper and old, brittle objects. But what really caught my attention was the faint outline on the driver's seat, a dark, shadowy imprint as though someone had been sitting there recently. I recoiled, my skin prickling with fear. I quickly left, telling myself I wouldn't go near that car again. But as the days passed, my curiosity only grew, a strange, obsessive need to understand the car's presence, to know who, or what, had left it there. One night, as I was leaving work, I noticed a strange shape in the car's rearview mirror. It was faint, barely visible, but I could have sworn I saw a face, a hollow, empty expression staring back at me from inside the car. My heart pounded as I backed away, trying to convince myself that it was a trick of the light, nothing more. But the face stayed with me, haunting my thoughts. Every night, I'd look over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone climbing out of that car, watching me from the shadows. The fear gnawed at me, but I couldn't resist the urge to look, to see if the face was still there. One evening, determined to put an end to my fear, I walked straight to the car, ignoring the chills running down my spine. I placed my hand on the cold, rusty hood and leaned in, peering through the driver's window. The inside was darker than ever, the shadows almost swallowing up the entire interior. I turned on my flashlight, scanning the back seat, the dashboard, looking for any sign of movement. Then, as my light crossed the rearview mirror, I froze. There, in the faint reflection, I saw it clearly, a face, blank and ghostly, staring straight at me with hollow eyes. It wasn't my reflection. I felt its gaze boring into me, cold and relentless, as though it were aware of me, waiting for me to see it. Panicking, I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight in the process. I grabbed it quickly and turned to leave, but as I did, I heard the faint sound of a car door creaking. My blood ran cold. I looked back, half expecting to see the car empty. But no, the door was still closed. The face in the mirror had vanished, leaving only the empty shell of the car staring back at me. I never parked near that row again, choosing spots as far from the car as possible. But the abandoned sedan never left. Each night, it waited, its grimy windows staring blankly across the lot. No one else seemed to notice it, as if it existed only for me, as if it were a private horror, bound to haunt me alone. One night, after weeks of avoiding it, I glanced back one last time as I left. And that's when I saw it, a faint silhouette standing beside the car, the shape of a figure with empty eyes watching me as I walked away. I turned and hurried out of the lot, too terrified to look back again. Even now, I still see that car in my dreams, parked under dim lights, waiting with its hollow, empty gaze fixed on me. And every time I pass by an old, abandoned car, I feel the weight of those eyes again, watching, waiting, haunting me still. I loved hiking in the secluded forest trails near my town. They were quiet, hidden from the rush of the world, winding paths that led deep into the trees. One weekend, I convinced a friend to come along with me. We packed a few snacks, brought our gear, and set off just after sunrise, eager to spend the day surrounded by nature. The trail we chose was less popular, winding through dense woods with trees that blocked most of the sunlight. It was an unusually quiet day. Even the usual bird songs seemed muted. We talked softly as we walked, our voices blending with the faint crunch of leaves underfoot. An hour into the hike, we heard something strange, a faint echo like the sound of a distant voice repeating our words. We both paused, looking at each other in confusion. I laughed it off, thinking it was just the acoustics of the forest. My friend was less convinced, but we kept walking, chalking it up to a trick of the dense woods. But as we continued, the echo persisted. Every few minutes, a whispery voice would repeat fragments of our conversation, slightly delayed, as though someone was mimicking us from deep within the trees. The more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't just an echo, it was something distinct, intentional. It copied our laughter, our words, even the rhythm of our footsteps. A shiver ran down my spine, but I forced a smile, trying to keep things light. My friend, however, was visibly uncomfortable. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his face pale, his unease growing with each step. He finally suggested we turn back, but part of me wanted to keep going, curious about the strange phenomenon. We walked in silence for a while, hoping the echo would stop, but it only became louder, more pronounced. Now, it wasn't just repeating our words, it was mimicking them in a soft, raspy voice that sounded wrong, distorted, like someone was struggling to form the words. We stopped again, both of us straining to listen. The forest around us was still, the silence oppressive, thick. And then, in the distance, the voice called out, repeating the last words my friend had spoken, but with an unsettling, mocking tone. It was unmistakably human, but hollow, devoid of warmth, like a poor imitation of our voices. My friend grabbed my arm, his face drained of color, and whispered that we needed to leave. I didn't argue. We turned back, quickening our pace, the trees around us seeming to press in closer, the shadows growing darker as we retraced our steps. The echo followed us, repeating our hurried words, laughing when we laughed nervously, each time growing fainter, as though retreating deeper into the forest. At one point, I glanced over my shoulder and thought I saw something, a dark figure standing just off the path, partially hidden behind a tree. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was enough to send a fresh wave of fear through me. I turned away, gripping my friend's arm, urging him to keep moving. The voice continued to echo, now mixing our words together, fragments of sentences blending into something that didn't make sense, a broken mimicry of our conversation. It sounded closer, as though it was following us, matching our pace with each step. When we finally saw the trailhead in the distance, we broke into a run, desperate to escape the oppressive silence of the woods and the strange, haunting voice. But just as we neared the end of the trail, the echo spoke one last time, in a voice that was no longer a mimic but something else entirely, cold, low, and somehow knowing. "Come back," it whispered, the words carrying through the still air. We didn't look back. We sprinted to the car, jumped inside, and sped off, leaving the trail and its unsettling echoes behind. To this day, I can't explain what we heard. I haven't returned to that trail, and my friend refuses to talk about it. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of my own home, I think I hear it again, that faint, mocking echo, as if something from the forest is still out there, repeating my words, waiting for me to return. Alright, that's all the stories for today. I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.